They escaped the mansion in a torn wedding dress while bullets shattered the window. Stephanie had just learned that her failed wedding was actually part of a much bigger plan. Reuben pulled her toward the window. The guards were kicking down the door, and the only way out was a 3-story climb down a broken trellis. Minutes later, they were bleeding, barefoot, and running from her father SS men as gunfire exploded behind them. Today, you and I are going to examine the psychological anatomy of a fractured family dynamic. Visualize the scene, a sprawling, dimly lit cathedral. At the altar stands Stephanie, so suffocating in heavy white silk, moments or just away from surrendering her autonomy, moment to the most lethal enforcer in her father's syndicate. She genuinely operated under the delusion that she had severed these pathological attachments when she fled to Barcelona. But a single phone call triggered her regression right back into the trauma bond. The man waiting to claim her is no accident of fate. It presents a stark life lesson for us to study. You can never truly outrun a toxic history when the poison is already pumping through your own veins.
Stick with me. We are about to dissect this tragedy, piece by piece.
The bridal gown draped over her trembling shoulders appears flawless to the untrained eye, yet clinically, it functions as a weighted restraint. This is not mere expensive fabric. Every single stitch and cold pearl acts as a psychological shackle binding her to the syndicate. She stands completely isolated in the echoing bridal suite of her father's Manhattan estate, staring into a massive gilded mirror. The hollow-eyed girl looking back is entirely dissociated, a classic symptom of severe emotional trauma. Here is a quiet life lesson we must document. Sometimes, the most exquisiting things in life are simply beautifully disguised cages. The truly chilling part of this behavioral study is that the dress fits her flawlessly. They engineered her confinement without ever needing to ask for her measurements. The heavy silence of room fractures the moment a calculated voice praises her appearance. Stephanie does not even turn her head, a clear display of emotional detachment. Adriano, her father and the absolute kingpin of this crime syndicate, steps into the suite and seals the heavy door behind him. He stands then tall, a silver-haired phantom wrapped in a dark custom suit. From a diagnostic standpoint, he wears the mask of sanity flawlessly, projecting the image of a legitimate businessman. But Stephanie understands the violent pathology beneath his polished exterior. She has studied his megalomania firsthand. The lesson here is grim but necessary. A predator rarely looks dangerous at first glance. They usually wear the comforting face of someone who claims to love you unconditionally. Observe the clinical tension pooling in the room, heavy and suffocating. The silence stretches between them, humming like a wire under extreme psychological strain. He studies his daughter with cold detachment. This is the man who once provided basic paternal care, now operating as the ruthless architect of her misery. You can identify the attachment disorder in the rigid tension of his jaw. He looks at her pale face, seem to pursue the wounds he's actively inflicting. Instead of offering comfort, he simply adjusts his gold cuffs and masks his more pure narcissistic control behind the justification of a protector. It reveals a fundamental life lesson. Genuine love must always serve as your ultimate safe haven, never a calculated transaction designed to slowly break your spirit. Pictures the acute psychological distress of this waking nightmare. Stephanie clenches her hands into tight fists, her nervous system flooded with unfiltered rage. We see her tear-stained cheeks as she forces eye contact with her abuser. Her voice cracks as she declares he no longer controls her life, labeling him aloud as a ruthless criminal. The tension is thick enough to choke on. Adriano, the megalomaniac Don, does not even register the insult. He breaches her personal space, his voice dropping to a terrifying, steady baseline. He weaponizes gaslighting, claiming this forced marriage to Ruben is purely to insulate her from his violent underworld. It is a bitter life lesson to digest. Sometimes the individuals claiming to shelter you from the storm are the exact architects who summoned the rain. The subject is hanging on by a rapidly fraying thread. Notice her frantic breathing, a clear indicator she is ready to shred that suffocating veil. She fires back, screaming that she does not require a warden, but projecting anger at a clinical narcissist is entirely futile. He absorbs her emotional outburst like an empty void, desperate to reclaim her agency. She deploys her final defense mechanism, claiming she met Ruben organically in Barcelona. The Don simply tilts his head with a chilling smirk. He already possessed this data. He was the architect who deployed Ruben's shadow her every movement. Watch the cognitive dissonance shatter her reality in real time. We must accept this crucial life lesson. Just because you believe you are making independent choices does not mean a pre-hidden predator is not secretly pulling your strings. The psychological manipulation hanging in the room operates on a staggering level of cruelty. Adriano casually delivers the final blow to her psyche. He admits he destined Ruben to act as her shadow, but claims the enforced developing an organic attachment was unscripted. Stephanie goes pale, her baseline reality dissolving into traumatic shock. She realizes her perfect romantic escape was a highly orchestrated trauma bond, the exact clinical foundation for Stockholm Syndrome. The Don simply counters with cold, sociopathic logic. He states that because Ruben genuinely cares, this twisted arrangement serves as the ultimate loyalty mechanism. The deepest psychological wounds never come from strangers, but who weaponize your deepest human affections for their own pathos. The Don executes his final psychological checkmate. He notes that since the emotional markers of love are already present, she simply needs to execute the physical marriage protocol. A profound, clinically cold hatred settles in her chest. She glares at him, swearing she will never forgive this violation of trust. Her father offers a detached nod, notes the ceremony commences in 20 minutes, and exits. Left completely alone, Stephanie studies the dissociated strange strews in the mirror. You and I can pinpoint the exact neurological shift where her flight response permanently converts orangey into a fight response. Evading her trauma failed. She requires a highly aggressive countermeasure. Sometimes running from your pathology only delays the inevitable collapse. You have to turn around and step directly into the fire. Let us review the case files back in Barcelona. Let us construct the baseline environment. Three weeks prior, Stephanie is bathed in the regulating sunlight of a Barcelona cafe. After suffocating in a high-control environment surrounded by syndicate operatives, this vibrant city simulated pure freedom. For one fleeting interval, her stress levels drop, allowing her to function like a standard civilian, but observe how quickly the denial shatters mirrors. Her phone vibrates on the table, projecting a demanding text from her megalomaniac father. The completely drains from her system. She violently shoves the device into her bag, employing classic avoidance behavior. It is a catastrophic error in judgment. Ignoring a glaring psychological red flag does not neutralize the threat. It simply grants the predator in the shadows more time to calculate its final strike against you. We must analyze the origin point of her escape to understand the scale of her delusion. Picture the freezing New York rain 6 months prior. She initiated a complete severing of her familial matrix, vanishing with untraceable currency and forged documents. She amputated every pathological tie. Early behavioral patterns showed severe hypervigilance and overactive nervous systems, causing her to flinch at every shadow, and convinced every pedestrian was a syndicate operative. But prolonged exposure to normal life inevitably suppresses that primal terror, and she falsely registered herself as safe. So, here is the tragic clinical truth about the human condition. The mental illusion of absolute safety is the most lethal cognitive trap we possess. The exact seconds allow your defensive mechanisms to power down, your untreated history comes hunting for blood. The timeline resumes in bright afternoon sunlight. She finishes her coffee, proceeding toward a predictable retail occupation. Generating legitimate income functioned as a grounding technique, making her feel beautifully unremarkable. Then, her somatic nervous system detects an anomaly. A sudden and freezing crawl of dread traces her spine. You and I are well acquainted with that biological alarm system. She freezes, her dilated pupils scanning the blurred sea of tourists. Nothing registers. She forces her muscles to relax, rationalizing the event as residual cartel paranoia. But we must strictly adhere to this biological rule. Always trust your primal survival mechanisms. Your body detects the apex predator long before your visual cortex processes the threat. Desperate to suppress the internal data, she isolates herself in a chaotic underground nightclub. The environmental stimuli shift to harsh, strobing neon. Stephanie leans against the surface of an underground bar. The low-frequency bass violently vibrates her skeletal structure, creating sensory overload designed to drown out her Mafia conditioning. It is a common psychological tactic. The most effective method to silence the trauma of your past is to deliberately deafen yourself with the chaotic frequencies of the present. While her civilian companion succumbs to the herd mentality of the dance floor, Stephanie's hyper-vigilant gaze continues scanning. Her focus locks onto a solitary figure anchored near the audio equipment. He operates with terrifying, predatory stillness. His dark presence is entirely foreign to this recreational environment. His cold eyes dissect the room with lethal tactical precision. He processes every variable, and her darkest past reality finally crystallizes. Let us open this case file and examine the pathology piece by piece. The heavy bass of the club creates severe sensory overload, but Stephanie registers only the frantic spike of her own pulse. Across the room, she locks eyes with a predator. The human mind often rationalizes danger, trying to categorize a threat as a mere trick of the light, but a second glance confirms her fear. He maintains unbroken ocular focus, offering a calculated smile that clinically strips away her psychological armor. The lesson here is unforgiving. When the shadow smiles back, the hunt has already begun. She forces her way through the crowd, her father's conditioning echoing in her cortex. Trust no one. She sprints into the freezing air, but her escape abruptly shatters when a calm voice cuts through the dark. Examine the psychological dynamics on this damp street. He instructs Stephanie to relax, his tone perfectly modulated to mimic warmth. He promises no harm, but her clinical history dictates that promises are simply painted bait. She stands her ground, demanding his motives. He waves it off as a coincidence, a standard deflection tactic. Then, he executes a brilliant behavioral pivot by admitting his guilt. In criminal psychology, owning a minor mistake completely disarms a target's defense mechanisms. He deliberately breaches her personal space. She should have retreated immediately, but the mental pull is active. The clinical reality is grim. Our most catastrophic big mistakes begin the exact moment we confuse a predator's target acquisition with genuine human connection. This is the critical window where her biological response should trigger immediate flight. Instead, she attempts to establish verbal dominance, threatening to wake the neighborhood. He merely nods, his baseline heart rate clearly unaffected. They walk past shuttered storefronts, the decaying environment mirroring her escalating internal panic. He asks for her name, and she provides an alias, whispering Anna. A skilled manipulator easily detects a fragile lie, but he allows the fiction to breathe, mirroring her deception by calling himself Ruben. They arrive at her apartment building. The clinical lesson here is simple and hard. Never allow an unidentified subject to track you to your primary shelter. Doing so only provides the predator with the exact coordinates of your absolute vulnerability. Ruben analyzes the architecture, offering a calculated compliment to test her psychological state. She dismisses it as a dump, a negative evaluation. He acknowledges with a heavy shrug. Stephanie observes him, experiencing cognitive dissonance as her survival instincts suddenly flatline. She repeats her inquiry about his motives. The charming mask drops. He admits she looked like she was running, projecting an empathetic understanding of her trauma. This manufactured shared vulnerability paralyzes her verbal responses. He murmurs goodnight and fades into the street. 2 days later, the illusion shatters. He is casually sitting in her local cafe. Clinical experience teaches us that coincidences do not exist. The shadows we fail to lose in the dark are systematically waiting for us in the daylight. Stephanie experiences acute paralysis in the doorway. Her body reacting to that tang. Across the room, he signals her with the ease of an established contact, overriding her brain's warning sirens. She sits down.
You are following me, she states, her vocal tremors betraying anxiety. He calmly denies it,
Suggesting a false narrative about his routine. When she points out a flaw in his timeline, he flawlessly pivots, claiming he is simply early. He then drops a tactical detail about her bookstore job, inducing a visceral somatic drop. He denies stalking her, offering coffee, and the illusion of free will. The psychological rule is clear. When a subject possesses a perfectly calibrated response for every accusation, you are engaging with a megalomaniac narcissist, and you are already losing. You and I have likely observed individuals making this exact cognitive error, blinded by the isolating pathology of loneliness. She absolutely should have terminated the interaction. Instead, she accepts the beverage, and the behavioral trap engages. Over a single week, Ruben systematically mirrors her routines. He avoids triggering her defense mechanisms by ignoring her repressed history. Her developmental years were spent on dodging physical violence, leaving her unequipped to identify the covert manipulation of a man offering passive peace. Finally, her psychological endurance breaks on a quiet beach. She demands his true motive. This highlights a fundamental law of criminal behavior. When a subject demonstrates flawlessly unyielding patience, they are usually excavating a grave for your autonomy. Ruben executes a verbal deflection, offering a vague excuse about transitional life phases. Stephanie breaks her passive pattern, directly questioning his criminal ties. He maintains heavy eye contact, asking her to define trouble. He utilizes a controlled confession, stating his past decisions angered highly violent individuals. She probes his personal capacity for violence. Ruben intensifies his gaze, assuring her he is no threat to her safety. It is clinically terrifying how her isolated mind actively seeks to validate his deception. "I am not who you think I am," she admits to the ocean. "I know," he replies. confirming his prior surveillance. Never trust a subject in a blue to didacty who dances around direct inquiries. That calculated evasion always directs the victim toward a fatal drop. He dismantles her fabricated identity, confirming Anna is merely a psychological shield. He then administers lethal emotional manipulation by offering absolute absolution, claiming her dark familial history is irrelevant. The defensive barriers Stephanie Yee spent years constructing collapse under this calculated validation. Experiencing acute emotional dysregulation, she asks why he treats her with such care. Because you deserve it, he states, weaponizing his perceived authenticity. She initiates physical contact, desperate for the dopamine hit of safety. Encased in his arms, her nervous system relaxes. The clinical reality is brutal. The exact moment a trauma survivor feels safe is typically the final manipulation before a predator initiates total destruction. They disengage physically, the atmospheric temperature dropping sharply. Ruben employs a delay tactic, promising to process the trauma narrative later. She exhibits compliance, and her cognitive dissonance resolves into a false sense of security. In psychopathological case, Stasi, such tranquility is merely a synthetic construct. 72 hours later, her isolated ecosystem violently ruptures. Her phone rings. The caller identification triggers an immediate cortisol flood. Marco Santini, her father's primary instrument of sociopathic enforcement foe. His vocal delivery lacks any emotional resonance. Your father wants you home, he commands. A victim can engage in geographical flight for years, but the ingrained behavioral programming of a violent family system will inevitably locate its target. Stephanie anchors herself to the counter, employing a physical grounding technique against the Oedipus. Her mind rejects a return to that generational abuse. Marco utilizes silence as a psychological weapon before delivering the catastrophic variable. We have your brother, he states, for physiological support fails, inducing neuromuscular collapse. She visualizes denial, demanding empirical proof. Instantly, the terrified vocal frequency of little Luca is transmitted, she spes. He begs his sister to comply before the connection terminates. Stephanie experiences severe tremors, fully aware of her father's capacity for malignant sadism. She abandons logic entirely. Psychological terrorism operates efficiently. It bypasses all mental defenses by targeting the one human attachment the victim simply cannot afford to lose. Let us analyze this critical juncture together. This is where the behavioral trap fully secures its mechanism. Ruben discovers her experiencing acute distress on the shoreline. Under severe duress, she verbalizes the lethal threat regarding her sibling. Ruben maintains his calculative proximity before executing a masterful manipulation. What if I can help? Stephanie experiences profound cognitive disorientation. With chilling composure, Ruben discloses his operational knowledge of her father's violent syndicate. Projecting an aura of omnipotent protection, she possesses zero empirical data on his true identity, yet his mirroring creates a flawless illusion of salvation. The reality of the savior complex is absolute. When a stranger reveals his tactical advantage, you are already locked inside his manufactured cage. Ruben uses physical contact to manipulate her perception of isolation. He demands certainty designed to override her critical thinking. Finding no deception in his eyes, she verbally finalizes her surrender, okay? In one breath, she authorizes a catastrophic error. The next 48 hours are a pure dissociative fugue state. She arrives in New York, where Marco's enforcers establish immediate perimeter. They transport her to the family compound. Her father, Adriano, sits in his structured environment of absolute control. "Welcome home, Bambina," he states, saturating the room with implicit threat. The pathology here is undeniable. If you willingly regress to the environment of your primary abuser, you cannot be surprised when the psychological trap snaps shut. Let us examine the subject, Stephanie, paralyzed by an acute trauma response, as she demands to see her son, Luke. The father figure, Adriano, displays classic psychopathic detachment. He simply pours a scotch, ignoring her panic. He calmly notes the boy is safe. When her voice inevitably shatters, Adriano offers the hollow smirk of a true megalomaniacal narcissist. He requires possession, not physical harm. This is a textbook psychological cage designed to systematically break her will. He mandates that in 21 days, she will marry Ruben, cementing a blood pact. Her reality collapses instantly. You and I must remember this tragic lesson. Never sit to play a hand against an absolute predator. Long before you even pull up your chair, the psychological deck is perfectly stacked against you. Adriano's laughter echoes against the stone walls like a clinical strike. He interrogates his daughter's delusion, mocking her belief that meeting a syndicate heir in Barcelona was fate. It was a manufactured illusion. He deployed Ruben to track her. That sweeping romance was Ruben's psychological masterpiece, a flawlessly constructed emotional cage. Stephanie's cognitive dissonance fractures. She sprints for the exit, but the enforcers capture her before she reaches the gravel. 24 hours later, she sits catatonic at the dining table. Wrapped in heavy silk, she studies the man who's systematically dismantled her autonomy, yet still wears the mask of a savior. Always remember this painful truth. Sometimes the charming prince sweeping you off your feet is actually the primary aggressor, dragging you straight back into the dark.
The ambient silence in the room manifests as a crushing weight. Ruben sits across the bed. Instead, there's a same golden warmth that previously anchored her trauma bond.
Stephanie avoids eye contact, eye fixating on her porcelain plate while suppressing a hysterical response. Adriano attempts to normalize the dysfunction by playing the proud patriarch, eagerly escheling the union. But Ruben effortlessly disrupts the dynamic. He demands isolation with the subject, projecting a chilling authority that forces even a hardened narcissist like Adriano to retreat. The heavy oak doors secure the perimeter. Ruben observes her rigid posture and delivers 4 calculated words. "I did not know." It is a harsh clinical lesson to carry. True power never needs to shout, as it dictates the reality of the room when it barely whispers. Stephanie's physical reaction is immediate, her eyes reflecting the acute agony of a ruptured attachment. Ruben leans across the table, his carefully maintained facade fracturing. He swears, his vocal tone rough desperation, that he possessed zero prior knowledge of her familial lineage. He insists he was merely a contracted operative tailing a runaway. She rejects this manipulative narrative entirely. If his claim holds empirical weight, she challenges, then why is he still enforcing this marital contract? Ruben's jaw clenches. He averts his gaze, employing the classic deflective defense that it is complicated. This triggers a complete psychological break. Stephanie Shuzu shoves her chair backward, screaming that he commodified her identity for strategic acquisition. Remember that this clinical absolute. When abusers claim their motives are complicated, they are merely preparing you for absolute behavioral chaos. Observe the wreckage of this interpersonal betrayal. Ruben weaponizes his wounded expressions, using them as a defensive shield. He audaciously whispers that his emotional investment exceeded his initial parameters. Stephanie experiences a severe physiological response, shedding hot tears driven by intense self-loathing. She despises her own psychological conditioning for believing in the Spanish sanctuary, confusing an elaborate behavioral cage with genuine safety. Pointing a trembling finger, she issues a firm boundary, demanding his exit. Ruben offers a standard manipulative assurance before retreating. Left isolated in the silence, her neurological tremors peak as the terminal reality solidifies. Her own genetic lineage is an inescapable prison. Note this psychological truth. Never place your faith in a subject who promises to rescue you from the very traumatic trap they engineered. With the marital acquisition 21 days away, the environment becomes highly claustrophobic. Stephanie exhibits severe insomnia, staring at a bedroom that captors a Kaz have clinically sanitized with by dawn. An acute panic attack overrides her logical functions. She laces up her shoes, executing a desperate flight response past the perimeter guards. You and I can almost measure her elevated heart rate as she covers 3 blocks. Predictably, an armored sedan intercepts her trajectory like an apex predator. The window drops to reveal the enforcer, Marco. He issues a flat command for compliance. She folds her arms, constructing a flimsy rationalization about morning exercise. But behavioral patterns do not lie. You cannot outrun your deepest systemic trauma, especially when those psychological demons operate armored vehicles. Marco entirely dismisses her verbal defense mechanisms. Stephanie's emotional regulation fails completely, screaming against her illegal confinement. She experiences a visceral urge to strike him, to shatter the reinforced glass, simply to re-establish a physical locus of control. However, her eyes register the heavy firearm concealed beneath Marco's tailored coat. The adrenaline instantly drains from her system. She recognizes the repetitive nature of this brutal cycle. Conceding defeat, she retreats into the vehicle. The transport back is defined by a suffocating silence. Approaching the fortified gates, Marco adopts a deceptive tone of empathy, hypothesizing that the narcissistic father genuinely loves her. Always scrutinize that justification. The most catastrophic psychological damage Clay's is routinely inflicted by those who claim they are operating in your best interest. Stephanie projects deep hostility, inquiring if her father dictated that manipulative dialogue. Marco displays a micro-expression of amusement, admitting the cognitive distortion is his own. This offers zero psychological relief, as verbal empathy cannot dismantle systemic captivity. She forces her exhausted form up the concrete steps. Inside, the maternal figure, Elena, occupies the dining area, manifesting as the untouchable matriarch of a criminal enterprise. Elena issues a rigid directive to consume nourishment, completely dissociating from the trauma fracturing her daughter's psyche. But Stephanie assumes the seat but firmly anchors her trembling hand beneath the table. It is a microscopic assertion of boundaries. Authoritarian figures can physically mandate your presence, but they can never neurologically compel you to internalize their fabricated reality. Let us evaluate the mother's pathology. Elena dispenses coffee with the severely blunted affect of a subject who has survived decades in a violent environment. Conditioned since birth, she wears her antisocial adaptations flawlessly. Stephanie spends youth executing avoidance behavior, terrified of mirroring this exact sociopathic baseline. When Elena casually references the Spanish operation, Stephanie's fragile composure shatters. She loudly verbalizes that her father deployed mercenaries to extract her. Elena's autonomic nervous system does not even register a spike. She clinically categorizes the forced union as an optimal resource allocation. We must isolate this specific variable. Being socialized in a high-threat environment forces rapid adaptation, but you must actively resist letting that permanently rewrite your standard definitions of normalcy. Stick with me here, because this is where the intergenerational trauma becomes all transparent. Scene Stephanie questions whether this arrangement addresses her well-being or as a tactical acquisition. Elena highlights Ruben's utility as a financial asset. The subject is physically trembling, vocalizing that Ruben utilized extreme manipulation. Her mother executes a dismissive gesture, completely invalidating her daughter's distress. She coldly recounts her own adolescent commodification, prioritizing hierarchical power over biochemical romance. When Stephanie pleads for basic self-determination, Elena delivers a devastating psychological strike. She confirms the subject has already exhausted her primary pre-flight opportunity. It is a haunting clinical reality. The difficult actions we fail to execute are the exact variables that permanently lock our behavioral cages. Elena maintains a regulated vocal tone, effectively concealing the predatory grin underneath. She clinically reminds her offspring that the European flight sequence was a catastrophic failure. Stephanie abruptly elevates from her position, the chair echoing sharply. She presents suicidal ideation rather than submit to the pairing. Elena processes this emotional volatility with sociopathic detachment. She diagnoses Stephanie as developmentally fragile, burdened by the cognitive distortion of a just world. You will be conditioned into ruthlessness, her mother guarantees. Stephanie escapes the perimeter, yielding to intense physiological dysregulation. By late afternoon, contractors breach the environment, masking the trauma with sterile white textiles. It is a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. The most stunning social ceremonies are frequently engineered to camouflage thoroughly shattered psyches. The facility is overwhelmed by imported flaw, creating a restrictive sensory environment. Stephanie is maneuvered through her domicile like a high-value captive. She is instructed to regulate her facial expressions and select between identical aesthetic materials. She exhibits profound dissociative symptoms, operating within a persistent traumatic fugue state. Civilian coordinated, entirely oblivious to the hostage dice enthusiastically COS input on visual arrangements. Stephanie delivers a flat-out, affectless response. When the coordinator reinforces the delusion that this is a joyous milestone, the subject nearly experiences a hysterical break. She gestures toward the patriarch, actively finalizing a lucrative cartel expansion. She is merely biological currency. Never succumb to this programming. Do not allow toxic entities to define your intrinsic value based solely on your utility to their own narcissistic objectives. We observe a classic hyper-vigilant trauma response. Stephanie turns the headrest lock on her door, but the mechanical click list offers zero neurological relief. When a subject is conditioned at birth by predators, brain never scanning the shadows for a lethal anomaly. She paces the floor, clinically mapping the threats. The guards, her father, then the psychological anchor drops. Luca, her little brother, is the emotional collateral tethering her to this violent syndicate. If she flees Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, will systematically dismantle the boy decide just to punish her disobedience. It is a clinical, unavoidable certainty. Our deepest emotional attachments are inevitably weaponized as our absolute most devastating vulnerabilities. Let you and I examine this behavioral profile together. Imagine the psychosomatic weight pressing Stefani's lungs. Her hands tremor as she dispatches a frantic text, desperate to extract Luca before their father's psychological hammer drops. The next afternoon, under a bruised Manhattan sky, her silent driver, Marco, pulls up to the boys' prep school. And there is Luca, a subject far too soft for the generational blood soaking his family tree. His face breaks into a desperate smile when he spots his sister, and she anchors him in a tight embrace. Even in the most pathological environments, we see this precise phenomenon. The only genuine stabilization in a deeply corrupt reality is the fragile warmth of the individuals we absolutely refuse to abandon in the dark. Luca exhibits a profound, startled response, whispering that he honestly believed she had vanished out permanently. Stefani observes her brother, noting the familiar crooked smile is now eclipsed by the heavy, exhausted shadow of chronic stress. His dissociated responses entirely shatter her composure. Driven by the suffocating proximity of Marco, they retreat into the freezing city park. As the winter wind bites at them, Stefani agonizes over how to expose the megalomaniacal pathology of their father. Suddenly, Luca halts in the frost. His voice fractures as he apologizes for acting as the bait that dragged her back into captivity. Facing your deepest internalized guilt is excruciatingly painful, but it remains the foundational first step toward true psychological maturity. The adolescent subject is drowning in a cognitive loop of guilt. Kicking the frozen dirt, he confesses their father manufactured a narrative that she was in mortal danger in Barcelona. The realization that he was merely a pawn in a megalomaniacal manipulation is fracturing his psyche. Stefani deholds her tone will drop a heavy whisper. The threat was entirely real. She clarifies, just devoid of firearms. She systematically shatters his illusions. Ruben was a phantom operative on their payroll. When genuine attachment formed, their father weaponized her own neurological chemistry for a syndicate merger. It is a terrifying behavioral reality. We must consistently analyze the data behind the curtain, because the most lethal traps are routinely disguised as a sweet romance. A suffocating vacuum descends over the park before Luca probes the central psychological wound. Does she actually love Ruben? The inquiry induces acute somatic pain. She rubs her eyes, the ache of betrayal settling in her chest. She believed she did, but how does one bond with a fabricated persona reading from a script? The foundational trust is deceased. Desperate, Luca grabs her hands, begging her to abandon the altar. She physically paralyzes. If she initiates flight, the Don will annihilate her brother to force compliance. She is bartering her autonomy for his survival. Luca recoils, visibly disgusted by her martyr complex. Let this clinical truth process. Love requires sacrifice, but one must never surrender the breed of autonomy just to keep another subject breathing. Stefani attempts to regulate his tone, but hostility in Luca's eyes refuses Bates' line. He demands she terminate this martyr complex, citing she successfully breached this containment at his age. The boy is prepared to endure absolute psychological torment to repurchase her autonomy. Tears blur Stefani's vision as she watches her brother crystallize into a hardened operative. He squeezes her fingers, offering the ignition source to incinerate the wedding. She craves that release, yet rationally calculates the catastrophic metrics of their father's retaliation. She agrees to process the option. They sit until Marco breaches their perimeter. Always catalog this variable. The intense, irrational loyalty of a family unit can serve as the most impenetrable psychological shield you will ever deploy. Stefani elevates from the frost. and Luca mirrors her posture, swearing hostilist. She initiates an issue before the clinical reality of their containment snaps back. Confined within Marco's sedan, she returns to the primary isolation zone. Desperate, she probes the driver, testing if he might facilitate an extraction. Marco remains an impenetrable baseline, stating the Don compensates him to ensure her security. Stefani asks, safe for who? The subject or the megalomaniac? Marco maintains focus on the road. She enters that massive estate knowing it is merely a highly sanitized penitentiary. Consider this paradox with me. The physical boundaries constructed to protect a subject are often the exact same parameters, keeping them permanently imprisoned. The Rubernal cycle concludes, and Ruben infiltrates the perimeter with the dominant, the sentries with the dominance of an apex predator, tracking Stefani to the library. She utilizes a thick text as a dissociative shield against her psychological trauma. His footprint echoes, triggering an immediate nervous system drop. She demands his objective. Ruben deliberately seals the heavy doors, establishing spatial control. She orders his retreat, but he casually occupies the arm of her chair, acknowledging she perceives him as a toxic threat. He requests 5 minutes to rationalize his behavioral betrayal. Exhausted, her emotional defenses collapse. You and I recognize this cognitive error. Grant a pathological trespasser a millimeter, and they will invariably colonize the entire psyche. The tension spikes as Ruben minimizes the physical distance. He testifies that when Vittorio proposed this merger, his baseline response was negative. His operation required no fabricated union. Then the megalomaniac deployed a tactical visual detailing her desperate need for extraction. Ruben hypothesized he could execute the merger while facilitating her autonomy. His voice fractures as he insists the courtship was not a clinical simulation. He intended to remain an observational variable, but mutual contact initiated an unexpected neurological cascade. He admits her presence completely dismantled his psychopathic architecture. Document this constant. One can engineer every behavioral sequence, but the unpredictable gravity of true human limerence will always fracture the tightest control matrix. Stefani clinically interrogates his expectations. Ruben admits he projected a standardized profile, a hollow syndicate dependent. Instead, he observed a subject aggressively fighting for normalcy. When she asserts her averageness, Ruben elevates her to extraordinary, a classic phase of idealization. She immediately reinforces her psychological barriers. Then, the unvarnished pathology surfaces. He confesses genuine emotional attachment. Yet he will still bind her to this contract. If he defaults, his faction will liquidate his assets. He is actively bartering her freedom for his absolute dominance. Always note this diagnostic marker. Evaluate a subject exclusively by the restrictive chains they apply, never by the romanticized vocalizations they deploy to keep you docile. Ruben traverses the room like a caged predator, rationalizing his coercion as a mandatory survival metric. He endured intensive syndicate conditioning since age 10. If he aborts the sequence, a rival bloodline will terminate his biology. Stefani's tone drops to absolute zero, noting he simply cannot tolerate a loss of status. His kinetic movement halts. The neurological distress in his eyes is authentic as he argues that securing his dominance does not negate his profound attachment. Stefani closes the distance, establishing a rigid behavioral boundary. She dictates that his affection is entirely worthless if it requires her indefinite captivity. The clinical takeaway is absolute. If an individual's operational objectives require you to occupy a cage, you must initiate a permanent extraction. Ruben's vocal stability shatters, denying his actions are driven by supremacy. Stefani challenges him to logically justify her trust. Stripped of his narcissistic armor, the predator whispers an admission of behavioral paralysis. He does not know how, as she pivots to exit, his autonomic defenses engage, clamping her wrist with a bruising restraint. He confesses his cowardice. He concealed his identity because he calculated her immediate flight response, and his ego could not process the deprivation. She projects a gaze of absolute zero, stating he cannot lose what he never possessed. He merely pulls her deeper into the shadows. Here is the clinical assessment. Constructing an attachment upon a foundation of deception guarantees a catastrophic psychological collapse. Let us examine this acute trauma response. Stefani is hyperventilating as the syndicate's trap triggers severe panic. Ruben locks onto her gaze, attempting to anchor her. He insists their history in Barcelona was authentic, untouched by the psychological poison her father, the kingpin, Vittorio, spreads so easily. Stefani demands empirical proof of his loyalty, accusing him of plotting betrayal. Ruben simply studies the tragic ruin of her face. He releases her wrist, stepping back to admit he has zero evidence left to offer. He hypothesizes that if she chooses isolation, she will rot in hostility. Trust in these dark environments is terribly fragile. Once a megalomaniacal narcissist shatters your baseline reality, rebuilding a bond requires the agonizing daily labor of honest action. Stefani exhibits absolute hostility in this interval. Ruben forces an emotional reaction exactly when she craves the dissociative safety of being numb. Her voice splinters as she commands him to leave. Ruben absorbs the verbal strike, nods, and retreats into the dark. What follows is a textbook period of depersonalization. We witness yards of white lace, cold footage, and vacant smiles. She flawlessly executes the role of the compliant Mafia princess, yet her cognitive state is fraying to dust. This anxiety inevitably drives her to breach her father's forbidden study. Faking your emotional baseline to maintain a toxic peace will systematically destroy your psyche. Wear a heavy mosaic mask for the crowd, and you will eventually suffocate the actual person underneath. The door clicks shut, isolating her inside the sanctuary of Vittorio, a man defined by malignant narcissism. Stefani operates in a state of hyperarousal, tearing through drawers and scanning ledgers. Her motor skills degrade as trembling fingers extract a folder for the Dick Castro alliance. Opening at her micro-expressions register pure terror. Brutal contracts spill out weapons trafficking, illicit funds, and the transactional terms of her marriage already authorized by both syndicates. She flips a page and her respiration halts. A buried clause dictates that canceling the wedding terminates the entire partnership. In my line of work, we learn to always hunt for hidden variables. Those most suppressed secrets hold the exact psychological leverage needed to completely dismantle a life. Observe the ultimate manifestation of Vittorio's pathology. A secondary clause mandates lethal retribution against immediate bloodlines if either faction withdraws. Stefani grips the desk as psychosomatic nausea strikes her nervous system. Her father, though, wagered their survival entirely on her compliance. Suddenly, the thud of heavy boots echoes in the corridor. An acute adrenaline spike hits her. She shoves the documents away, slamming the drawer just as Marco's shadows lead into the room. His flat, sociopathic affect analyzes her shivering frame, asking if she is well. She forces a swallow, whispering a fabrication about insomnia. He casually instructs her to rest. The heaviest psychological chains we drag through life are almost always look onto us by selfish individuals who never asked for our consent. The environment shifts to a sterile bridal boutique. Stefani stands motionless, exhibiting the flat effect of a condemned prisoner. Seamstresses pin the heavy silk around her, acting as wardens fitting a luxurious straitjacket. Her mother, Elena, lounges nearby, sipping champagne with a remarkable deficit in maternal empathy. Elena smiles coldly, labeling the gown as regal. Stefani provides only suffocating silence. Swirling her drink, Elena casually confesses she sobbed her entire wedding morning until her makeup was ruined. When Stefani asks why, the superficial warmth vanishes from Elena's vocal tone. She admits she was paralyzed with terror. Dressing up a dark family tradition in expensive lace does not alter the clinical reality. It is simply pure intergenerational trauma being violently handed down to the next captive subject. Elena casually asserts her life turned out fine, displaying textbook cognitive dissonance. Stefani's dissociative facade shatters, replaced by acute hostility. She challenges that false reality, and Elena's polished smile disintegrates. The psychological dam breaks. Stefani unleashes decades of repressed rage, shouting that her mother married a malignant narcissist who gambles like casino chips. Elena physically isolates her daughter in a corridor, pinning her against the wall. She hisses, asking if Stefani thinks she is oblivious to the blood on Vittorio's hands. Stefani leans in, diagnosing her mother as a willing enabler. A sharp slap violently snaps Stefani's head back, ripping the comfortable blindfold of deep denial off a subject guarantees they will immediately lash out with their absolute worst wrath. The physical strike echoes sharply in the hall. A contusion forms on Stefani's cheek, yet her focus remains unflinching. Elena invades her space, delivering a venomous directive to never pass judgment. The matriarch's emotional regulation fails. She weaponizes her historical trauma, asserting Stefani cannot comprehend was made to sickening sacrifices made to sustain this criminal enterprise. Elena claims she played the submissive pawn solely to ensure their survival. Her affect flatlines completely. She brutally reminds Stefani she is not an exceptional martyr, merely the next compliant subject in a generational cycle of transactional marriages. She dares her daughter to terminate the wedding and collapse the alliance. Pathological family units despise watching a target escape. They will gladly forge heavy chains out of suffocating guilt to drag you back into their dysfunction. Observe the physiological tremors in Stefani's refrain. Elena's manipulation lingers. A textbook presentation of a mother is destabilizing her offspring. Elena claims she raised her to be superior, dismissing Stefani's distress as a temporary spike before retreating, yet profound grief acts as a potent behavioral catalyst. Later, immersed in the isolation of the estate, Stefani infiltrates Vittorio's study. She understands that initiating overt conflict guarantees a lethal outcome for her brother Luca, a classic hostage dynamic. She pivots to covert sabotage. The monitor casts harsh shadows across her face. She inputs the Don's birthday, but access is denied. When the primary pathway is blocked, you do not simply terminate the operation. You step back, analyze the perimeter, and locate the hidden vulnerability. The red light of the system reflects in her dilated pupils. Stefani inputs her mother's birth sequence. Access denied, her motor control slipping. She punches in the birth date of her brother, Luca. A click follows, bathing the room in a sickly green glow. She stabilizes her respiration and plunges into Vittorio's digital archive, a graveyard of sociopathic commerce. Decades of violent transactions load. Deep within a restricted directory, one file demands attention, a wedding day contingency. Opening the document, Rapid vasoconstriction drains the color from her face. It is a formulated execution roster. At the top is a preemptive directive to assassinate Ruben de Castro should the alliance show any instability. The Don engineered her marriage as slaughterhouse trap.
It is a terrifying psychological reality. The individual projecting the warmest smiles at your table might be the predators excavating your grave.
You and I need to analyze this moment together, because the clinical depth of Vittorio's paranoia is staggering. Stefani scrolls through the data, recognizing the Don has engineered a lethal conclusion for every variable. If Ruben renegotiates or walks away, termination is the mandated response. However, megalomaniacs possess one fatal cognitive blind spot. Vittorio never calculated that his compliant daughter might initiate a rebellion. She collapses into the chair, experiencing a complete paradigm shift. For weeks, she classifies Ruben as a cruel adversary, but the data proves he's merely a vulnerable target in her father's crosshairs. From a behavioral standpoint, the most courageous action some obsessed can take is to shield the individual they were conditioned to despise. Her trembling fingers draft a desperate plea to meet. His reply illuminates the room, the old marina-y midnight. Stefani meticulously scrubs as her digital footprint and exits the suffocating study. For the first time, she experiences the neurochemical thrill of autonomous choice. Fully aware that betraying a cartel leader represents a point of absolute no return, the location, Zane shifts to the abandoned marina. The conditions are harsh, saturated with the scent of oxidized iron, and freezing, some scored by the crash of the black tide. She stands at the edge of Pier 9, burying trembling hands inside her coat to mask her physiological stress. Ruben materializes slowly from the dense fog. "You came," she vocalizes into the wind. "You asked," he responds, his tone registering as cold stone. He closes the distance, demanding the logical rationale for meeting in this desolate sector. To successfully reclaim agency over your life, you must confront your deepest psychological terror directly. And Stefani closes her eyes and draws one agonizing breath. Observe their proximity as she discloses her infiltration of Vittorio's encrypted server. Ruben's posture shifts instantly. His musculature coils defensively as he demands the empirical results of her search. She maintains ocular contact, her voice failing as she delivers the clinical death sentence. If their transactional marriage falters, her father authorized his immediate termination. Ruben freezes, his exhalations turning to visible vapor. He aggressively requests confirmation of this data. She nods, detailing the execution parameters and psychopathic methodology. Vittorio preemptively engineered this betrayal. Ruben drags a trembling hand through his hair, processing the cognitive shock. As he asks the critical question, why risk lethal retaliations to warn a classified enemy? In behavioral modeling, raw vulnerability is the only viable foundation for authentic trust. Her rigid affect softens, tears pooling as she validates his hypothesis. Their bond in Barcelona was entirely genuine. When reviewing the behavioral files of syndicate heirs, we often see rigid defense mechanisms. Yet here Stefani drops the heavy iron armor of her Mafia upbringing. She steps closer to Ruben, her voice a fractured whisper, confessing she cannot let her father put him in the ground. She outlines the bleak reality. If she flees, her brother Luca, trapped in severe Stockholm syndrome, faces the executioner. Open war means two triumphant families drown the city in blood, but together they might survive. This shows us a fragile human truth sometimes. The absolute bravest act is simply reaching out to ask for help. Ruben tightly grips her trembling hand, pledging his life. She pulls out her phone, the screen illuminating his faceplace like a digital guillotine in the black night. Today, you and I are going to unpack this behavioral shift together. The cold light from the phone washes over Ruben, casting hollow shadows under his eyes. Reading the screen, the psychological horror sets in. His own bloodline is orchestrating this slaughter. This union was a loaded weapon, and these megalomaniac narcissists were firing their children into the abyss. We must all eventually confront a bitter reality. The very people designated to protect us are frequently the ones twisting the knife in the dark. Stephanie holds his shattered gaze, swearing to reduce their fathers and the entire empire to ash. A slow, terrifyingly cold smirk cuts across the face of Ruben. The obedient son dies right there on the wet concrete. They pivot away, disappearing into the fog to ignite the war. Ruben dissolves into the fog, leaving Stephanie swallowed by the oppressive silence of the docks. She retreats to her idling car, where Marco, her lifelong driver, sits like a stone sentinel. As the iron gates of the estate of her father bleed through the windshield, she asks softly if he could look the other way for one night. Marco keeps his eyes locked on the road, his jaw clenching. When she breathes the word wedding, his knuckles turn stark white. In my clinical experience, she is asking this man to draft his own suicide note. True loyalty is a devastatingly rare currency, proving that defending someone often demands risking your very life. Marco slowly turns to study her pale, exhausted face, feeling the weight of the impending destruction. She only needs his silence to win. Marco holds her gaze in the rearview mirror, the psychological tension stretching until it threatens to snap. Finally, the loyal driver lets out a heavy sigh. He states, completely devoid of emotion, that he never saw her leave the estate tonight. If the compound burns on the wedding day, his alibi is carved in stone. You and I know perfectly well that true survival often demands we quietly bend the rules when a deeper morality is on the line. A tear of relief slips down the cheek of Stephanie, but the hardened eyes of Marco silence her comfort. If her gambit fails, they will be buried in the same unmarked grave. She steps out into the freezing mist, her posture shifting from daughter to soldier. For the next 72 hours, she delivers a terrifying masterclass in deception. To her ruthless father, the ultimate megalomaniac narcissist, she masterfully shrinks back into the fragile, obedient doll he always demanded. But past those exhausted eyes, the gears of a lethal psychological war are grinding into place. Life teaches us a vital lesson. The most devastating strategy in any conflict is allowing your enemy to confidently believe they have already won. Beneath this camouflage, she meets Ruben in a rotting motel room. He paces the stained carpet like a caged wolf, arguing they need undeniable proof to shatter the alliance permanently. Stephanie sits flawlessly still on the edge of the sagging bed, illuminated only by the pale glow of her laptop. Without blinking, she whispers that she knows exactly where the hidden files are kept. Stick with me here, because the psychological pressure in that tiny room becomes absolutely suffocating. The documents are locked, military encryption, inside the downtown fortress. Ruben stops his frantic pacing, asking if she can actually get past the armed guards. She outlines a desperate theory, fake a panic about the wedding contracts to buy a razor-thin mid-minute window. Ruben flashes a dark, predatory smile. 5 minutes is all they need to drain a decade of blood money. But a wave of noise washes over Stephanie, decide to spore. Choose him so tall. And standing up for the truth means watching your entire world turn to ash. When the smoke finally clears, her deeply narcissistic father will know exactly which of his children held the match. Ruben sinks onto the mattress beside her, his voice heavy with a sobering clinical truth. The second they initiate the download, their generational wealth and syndicate protection will vanish into thin air. They will become the hunted. He searches the depths of her dark eye, asking if she can weather a storm of bullets. Stefani quietly studies his face. The man who once manipulated her is now her only anchor to reality. She throws the question right back. Is he ready? Ruben gently reaches out, tugging a stray curl behind her ear, a tragic gesture of attachment that nearly shatters her iron composure. He whispers that he has wasted his entire youth playing the loyal Mafia prince. Living solely to fulfill the violent expectations of others is merely a slow death. He smiles softly. The camera circles them in the shadowy library. That raw vulnerability shatters her final psychological defenses. Stefani surges forward, pulling him into a desperate kiss. I want us to look at this closely. It is the frantic embrace of two doomed subjects clinging together while the cartel underworld collapses around them. Breaking apart, Ruben presses his forehead against hers, whispering a quiet promise that they will survive. You and I both know it is a magnificent, tragic lie. They are marching straight into a slaughterhouse. But sometimes, wrapping ourselves in a beautiful delusion gives us the mental armor required to face the firing squad. 3 days before the ceremony, Stefani pushes open the heavy doors of the office. Waiting behind a massive desk is Adriano, the mob king. Adriano feigns pleasant surprise as his daughter glides into the dim study. Displaying narcissistic control, he flashes an arrogant smile, praising her intellect while sliding the folder across the desk. She needs to analyze the fine print before signing her freedom away. Stefani delivers a flawless performance, tracing the legal jargon while her mind locks onto her target. True discipline in life is possessing the patience to sit still until the moment arrives to strike. A sudden vibration shatters the quiet. Adriano frowns at his phone, mutters an excuse and steps into the hall. Millicent, that door clicks shut. The dutiful daughter vanishes. She bolts around the desk, jamming a drive into the machine just as a cold password prompt flashes on the monitor. Her hands tremble as she punches the birthday of her traumatized brother Luca into the keyboard. The screen flashes a sickly green, illuminating her face. She uncovers the restricted folders, downloading the darkest secrets of her family. Hit lists, corrupt contracts, endless blood money. The progress bar crawls. 10%. 20. A cold sweat races down her neck. 40. Heavy footsteps echo in the hall. 60. Remaining perfectly calm when the psychological walls are closing in is the ultimate test of human endurance. The brass doorknob turns at 80%. She violently yanks the drive free, burying it in her pocket just as Adriano swings the door wide. Her heart hammers furiously against her ribs. He casually asks if the terms suit her. Stefani simply forces a deadpan smile. Adriano breaks the heavy silence, flashing a calculated smile. He whispers how proud he is, assuring her she is making the right choice. Stefani beams back, pouring every drop of deception into her expression, and quietly agrees. The second her boots hit the pavement outside, she releases a massive trembling breath. She fires a rapid text to Ruben. Got it. His reply illuminates the screen instantly. Good. Now we wait. You and I know the darkest truth of human psychology. The most dangerous lies are always delivered behind a warm, gentle smile. By Friday morning, the estate descends into absolute madness. Armed guards, frantic florists, and endless seas of white roses flood the grounds. It looks exactly like a beautiful fairy tale, but in this underworld, tales always end in blood. Stefani exhibits the paralysis of a trauma victim. staring at the silk wedding gown as if observing a finely tailored coffin. Luca enters the dim bedroom, displaying the profound emotional exhaustion typical of chronic subjugation. He slumps onto the mattress, wisp a desperate bid to disrupt her fatalistic compliance. Clinically speaking, her response is a textbook isolation tactic, and she grasps his trembling hand, her gaze warning him to stay far away from the impending carnage. You and I must remember a fundamental behavioral truth frequently. The most effective method to shield our deep attachments is to forcefully push them into the cold. Luca remains paralyzed, cognitively, unable to process the dark reality of her impending sacrifice within the syndicate structure. Luca exhibits the hypervigilance of a subject conditioned by a volatile environment. He recognizes her dangerous baseline, yet demonstrates compliance by swearing to avoid the crossfire. Stefani initiates a desperate embrace, Southern spike and attach in a behavior driven by the fear of permanent separation. Once isolated, she transitions into a methodical investigative state, accessing her father's stolen digital archives. In the silent state, she uncovers a hidden thread of messages connected to an alias V. Constantine. As behavioral analysts know, psychopathy often reveals itself in the most obscure details. The grand wedding is a calculated slaughter meant to eradicate a rival bloodline. Unchecked, malignant narcissism inevitably demands a devastating, unforgiving human toll. Bathed in armament monitor light, Stefana possesses the horrific blueprints of her father's plot. The directive is clinically efficient: assassinate the young heir, Reuben, and manufacture a tragic accident. Observe how the patriarch categorizes his own daughter. The man who modeled primary caregiving now dismisses her as a disposable asset, planning to confine her once her utility expires. This is a textbook manifestation of a megalomaniac narcissist, where familial bonds are entirely transactional. The pathology of absolute control operates like a cognitive parasite, completely devouring any capacity for genuine empathy. A profound life lesson emerges here. The most devastating psychological betrayals frequently originate from our primary attachment figures. The opulent wedding and the white dress function entirely as a psychological snare, utilizing Stefani as high-value bait. We observe her exhibiting physiological stress response as she transmits the incriminating data directly to Reuben. While she had previously rationalized her father's antisocial traits, this shatters her cognitive dissonance, revealing an abyss of clinical cruelty. Suddenly, Reuben responds, proposing a severe escalation. He insists on accelerating the timeline to strike during the ceremony itself. When faced with an existential threat, the organism's most viable defense is absolute force. You and I must understand the necessity of reclaiming personal agency. Allowing individuals with dark triad traits to dictate your fate inevitably ensures your destruction. Reuben's directive lacks emotional modulation. His clarity is purely tactical. He calculates that the moment the vows conclude, her father will initiate the execution protocol. The B. Stefani registers acute autonomic arousal, a biological indicator of the immense risk. It initiating conflict inside a sanctuary filled with armed syndicate members borders on suicidal ideation. He instructs her to meet at the church at 7 in the morning. As she gazes into the dark, we observe for criminal sci-fi, which the optimal window to neutralize an aggressor is precisely when their narcissistic grandiosity makes them feel invincible. Her father slumbers nearby, completely unaware his primary asset is preparing to dismantle his entire empire. She adopts dark clothing and quietly exits into the dawn. The sanctuary doors open into a highly controlled environment. Ruben occupies the front pew, his presentation far removed from a traditional groom. Dressed in tactical black, he projects the cold effect of an executioner. Her bitter smile serves as a micro-expression of a newfound psychological resilience. She has completely rejected the passive victim role. Ruben extracts a military-grade signal jammer designed to disrupt the antagonist's communication network. In any dominance hierarchy, securing environmental control is paramount. We must learn to dictate the parameters before any aggressive act occurs. By neutralizing all cellular signals, they effectively sever the megalomaniac from his operational muscle. With measured precision, Ruben passes her a silver flash drive. Ruben explains the drive contains the syndicate's core secrets. Stefani experiences acute somatic anxiety staring at the metal. She questions the delivery mechanism, and Ruben reveals a sophisticated digital intrusion. He has hijacked the ceremonial live stream. Upon activation, this data will flood the public domain. She realizes he has orchestrated this defensive maneuver from the very beginning. When her vocal fracture betrays a feeling of exclusion, he provides a clinical rationale. Her behavioral innocence had to remain completely uncompromised to deceive her father's hypervigilance. We see a complex paradox of human attachment here. Occasionally, withhold traumatic information from someone you deeply care for is the only reliable method to ensure their physical survival. Ruben articulates a profound shift in his behavioral pattern, which is his first significant reliance on interpersonal trust. Stefani evaluates the device, cognitively mapping the severe systemic collapse that will follow. The established hierarchy will be violently dismantled. Observing Ruben, we see a subject who has entirely discarded his psychological armor. He prefers terminal liberation over chronic subjugation within a malignant structure. You and I must recognize this psychological reality. True autonomy is never voluntarily relinquished by those exhibiting psychopathic control. The transition of power always demands a severe emotional and physical toll. Displaying a cognitive override of her acute fear response, she closes her trembling fist over the drive. She is ready to initiate the sequence. As evening approaches, Rodriguez's high-ranking figures of the syndicate assemble. The motorcade delivers antisocial personalities, Rini draped in the outward markers of success. Two historically antagonistic factions sit in close proximity, manipulated into believing this signifies structural stabilization. Their lack of situational awareness blinds them to their imminent destruction. Stefani utilizes a tall mirror to verify her camouflage. She is perfectly executing the behavioral script of the submissive heir, yet secured against her skin lies the mechanism of their undoing. This highlights a fundamental concept in psychological unconscious threat assessment. The most compliant, innocent appearances are frequently mask the most lethal countermeasures. Marco's heavy knock provides the external stimulus to begin the final protocol. Marco occupies the doorway, his facial effect flattened, typical of an enforcer desensitized to violence. He questions her certainty. Stefani's negative response indicates a massive cognitive load. Marco validates this, correctly interpreting her fear as an indicator of neurological clarity. The transit to the venue is a period of acute anticipatory anxiety. She visualizes the sequence, the signal disruption, the ceremonial prompt, the digital execution. We must deeply understand this manifestation of resilience. Clinical bravery does not require suppressing the autonomic fear response. It is the executive function overriding the instinct to flee, stepping forward despite overwhelming physiological stress. The vehicle stops, her heels strike the concrete, and the operational trap is armed. The atmosphere within the sanctuary reflects a high concentration of aggressive personality, confined in a single space. Stefani observes the patriarch, his posture exuding the grandiose satisfaction of a narcissist who believes his manipulation is flawless. Beside him, her mother exhibits the silent weeping of an enabler trapped by learned helplessness. At the altar, Ruben's grounding nod serves as a vital psychological anchor amidst predators. The pipe organ creates an auditory overlay of sanctity, generating severe cognitive dissonance with the impending violence. This illusion reinforces a critical behavioral warning: never allow pristine environments to artificially lower your internal threat perception. Anchoring herself to Marco, she begins the measured progression toward the focal point of the snare. Mid-transit, the haptic feedback against her skin confirms the first operational phase as the jammer is active, establishing an isolation perimeter that severs the megalomaniac from his external resources. At the altar, Ruben's physical cognitive functions as an immediate regulator for her nervous system, stabilizing her tremors. The officiant begins a script emphasizing loyalty, a profound irony given the sociopathic environment. Stefani's executive attention remains fixated on the surveillance equipment above. The ritualistic prismatic prompt for objections is finally vocalized. Come with me on this final point in the clinical study of violent ecosystems. The mastery of precise timing and often separates the survivor from the casualty. Ruben applies pressure to her hand, a final tactile signal. The threshold is breached. The defensive strike begins. Let's open this case file together, shall we? Observe the subject, Stephanie, experiencing acute panic. Her fingers slip beneath the silk of her gown, searching for a metal drive. It is missing. The physiological response is immediate: await her chest, stealing her oxygen. Then comes the psychological trigger. Her father, Adriano, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, stands in the bloody stained glass light. He holds the stolen drive, his voice dripping with calculated venom as he asks if she truly believed she could outsmart her own blood. Beside him stands Marco, a hollow shell exhibiting Stockholm Syndrome, entirely loyal to his captor. It is a harsh life lesson: never underestimate the monster mouse who built the psychological maze you are trying to escape. The clinical term for this environment is a high-stress containment zone. The crushing betrayal drains the oxygen right out of the vaulted cathedral. Adriano stands victorious, holding the key to their digital rebellion. Marco, the stoic shadow she trusted, has been feeding her secrets to the wolf. This is classic Stockholm Syndrome. Marco claims his betrayal was an intervention to save from her own foolishness, fully rationalizing his captor's abuse. Ruben steps forward, knuckles white with repressed adrenaline, but the megalomaniac narcissist just laughs. Adriana knew about the livestream hack from the beginning, feeding his own grandiosity. The lesson here is painfully clear: never assume you hold the winning hand when playing against a true psychopath. The house always wins. Adriano thrives here, metabolizing the heavy dread of the room as if it were pure oxygen. This is how the megalomaniac narcissist regulates his self-esteem. He lets his dead gaze drag over Ruben, whispering that he enough buried secrets before to ruin every soul in those woodens and pewsoos. Ruben clenches his jaw until the bone nearly cracks, completely paralyzed by situational helplessness. The Don smooths his lapels, flashing a hollow, predatory smile. He leans close to his trembling daughter, commanding her to say her vows and pay for this treason forever. She hisses her hatred, but his smile only deepens. feeding on her emotional dysregulation. Life teaches us a simple, brutal truth. If a malignant personality looks you in the eye and promises to destroy you, believe them the first time. Notice the physiological responses here. The terrified priest drowns in a cold sweat under Adriano's absolute control. Beside the altar, Samsia drifts into a state severe dissociation. Her psyche is temporarily shattered by the trauma. She grips her groom's hands, but behind her blank eyes, she has mentally checked out. Months of meticulous planning to dismantle her father's empire have burned to ash. They exchange rings with violently trembling fingers, fine motor skills wrecked by cortisol. Reuben speaks his vows, tying his fate to this sinking ship. Then, the suffocating silence falls squarely onto Stephanie, waiting for her compliance. We only truly learn what our psychological resilience is made of now when our back is firmly pressed against the absolute bottom. Stick with me, because this is where our clinical observation explodes into acute chaos. Instead of succumbing to total compliance, Stephanie's fight-or-flight instinct fiercely activates. She looks Reuben in the eye, whispers an apology, and bolts down the aisle like a hunted animal. The church erupts into absolute madness as the megalomaniac narcissist loses his control and roars vicious commands. She crashes through the grand doors into the blinding sun, refusing to be a submissive victim, but reality is an unyielding wall. She barely clears the stone steps before massive arms wrap around her, slamming her violently onto the pavement. It is Marco, acting out his severe Stockholm syndrome. The bitter lesson is clear. Running away only works if you actually built a secure escape route first. Stephanie exhibits pure primal survival, clawing at the pavement, but Marco is a merciless enforcer, pinning her fragile frame against a cold sedan. Her screams tear through the morning air, yet Marco lacks all empathy, entirely brainwashed by his Stockholm syndrome. Slowly, Adriano steps out from the shadows. Watch the megalomaniac narcissist at work. He casually adjusts his cuffs. Entirely disconnected from the psychological devastation he just inflicted on his own daughter, with a cold, detached voice, he orders his men to cage her. They shove her violently into the back seat. As the heavy door slams, her dilated eyes lock onto Reuben. He is just standing there, watching her vanish. Sometimes the people who swore to protect you will stand perfectly still and simply watch you fall. You and I have probably both witnessed this kind of emotional crash. Reuben did not lift a finger. A sickening cognitive realization washes over Stephanie. He knew the escape was doomed. Later, she paces her high-end prison bedroom, exhibiting severe hyperarousal. She launches a brass lamp into the wall, glass shattering in a violent rain. She goes on a rampage, destroying the room in an explosive release of pent-up emotional trauma. Eventually, the adrenaline burns out. She collapses onto the cold floor, her nervous system shutting down into a depressive state as hours bleed away. Then, a sharp click echoes from the door. Throwing a wild tantrum might give you a fleeting psychological release, but when the dust settles, you are still locked in the exact same cage. Stephanie looks up from the wreckage, her defense mechanisms bracing for the megalomaniac narcissist's wrath. But it is Reuben in the doorway. She demands he leave, her voice raw, but he simply steps inside and locks the heavy door. She accuses him of knowing they were doomed. Reuben displays a fascinating level of cognitive control. He does not flinch. He admits he suspected the trap all along. Why keep his bride in the dark? Because he needed her authentic, unfiltered panic to sell the deception. He needed Adriano to believe he had utterly crushed their spirits, feeding the father's grandiose delusions. Reuben crouches down, locking his eyes on hers. Honesty is a beautiful, noble trait, but sometimes keeping a painful trait is the absolute only way to survive a deadly psychological game. Let's analyze this psychological pivot. Ruben drops his voice, promising the game is far from over. Stephanie, severely fatigued, argues her father already holds the evidence. Ruben offers a calculated smirk. He reaches into his jacket and pulls out an identical silver flash drive. The one Adriano took was a decoy. Anticipating the megalomaniac narcissist's predictable need for control, Ruben surrendered a fake. He already sent the real files to the authorities. By sunrise, their toxic empires will be reduced to ash. Weaponizing her genuine trauma to bypass Adriano's paranoia was a move of terrifying, calculated brilliance. That is deeply ingrained in behavior of never on Ginjo. Single can always keep your true advantage hidden from the light. Ruben looks into her eyes, apologizes for the psychological cruelty of his methodology. He explains that her father's hypervigilant gaze would have detected deception instantly. Stephanie's cognitive processing struggles to catch up. The mighty Don is about to lose his empire. A broken, hysterical laugh escapes her lips, a classic symptom of emotional overload. She calls them both completely insane. Ruben simply shrugs, accepting the madness. The heavy reality sets in. They could easily be executed for this defiance. But Ruben pulls her to her feet, grounding her panic with a firm grip. He frames her face, overriding her anxiety by swearing they are not dying tonight. You truly discover who will stand by your side when the world turns against you and the heavy alarms finally begin to wail. I want you to pay close attention because the psychological stakes are about to double. Seeing the desperate hope in his gaze, Stephanie whispers her surrender, cementing their trauma bond. He pulls him in for a defiant kiss while their world explodes around them. It is the absolute behavioral point of no return. But this fragile moment shatters as heavy boots echo down the hallway. Ruben's brain snaps straight into cold, autonomic survival mode. He mutters that as they are out of time, dragging her toward the massive window. He clinically assesses her motor skills, asking if she can climb. She peers over the ledge, staring down a terrifying 3-story drop to the jagged stones. Always make sure you have a clear way out before declaring war on a truly dangerous, narcissistic man. Stephanie looks at him as if he is exhibiting clinical psychosis, pointing out the high probability of snapping her neck. Ruben's amygdala remains completely suppressed. He is totally unfazed. He pries the window open, scanning a fragile wooden trellis. He computes the risk, muttering that it will probably hold. Stephanie is paralyzed by vertigo, but the violent footsteps outside are multiplying. Her father, the megalomaniac narcissist, sent a hit squad to neutralize the threat. They have under 2 minutes before the door becomes kindling. She stares at the barricade, weighs the lethal plunge into the dark, and breathes a weary agreement. Let this be your guiding thought when your options are certain psychological destruction or a blind physical leap. You take the leap every single time. Let us open this file together, you and I, and examine the raw physiology of an escape. Ruben displays a textbook acute stress response, wasting no time on hesitation. His motor functions take over as he tests the structural integrity of the rotting trellis. It groans under his weight, but survival instinct overrides basic logic. He signals Stephanie with a stark, nonverbal directive. She sheds her social conditioning immediately, abandoning her heels to step onto the freezing ledge. The sound of her father's enforcers breaching the door acts as an auditory trigger, flooding her nervous system with absolute panic. Ruben watches, his micro-expressions betraying dread as the lattice splinters. The clinical takeaway is undeniable here. The human mind will gladly abandon all learned pride the moment biological survival demands we flee into the dark. Notice the behavioral fixation in this sequence. Ruben instructs her to avoid visual contact with the ground, a standard grounding technique to prevent vertigo. However, the psychological weight of terror is overwhelming, pulling her gaze downward. The violent breach of her childhood bedroom door creates a catastrophic sensory overload. The auditory assault of the soldiers triggers a severe panic cascade. Stephanie loses her grip, her dermal tissue tearing against the wood until Ruben forcefully arrests her fall. But structural failure interrupts this brief stabilization. The trellis detaches entirely, sending plummeting into the freezing soil below. Ruben forces her traumatized body back into motion, demanding she run. The psychological assessment leaves us with a stark reality. The physical world remains entirely indifferent to the survival strategies of deeply traumatized youth. We see the fight or flight response fully activated here. Stephanie moves through the ruined estate, her physical deterioration mirroring the collapse of her father's empire. The gunfire acts as a brutal auditory trigger of Kingpin Vittorio's obsessive control. Clinically, we must label Vittorio's actions as the ultimate psychological manipulation of a megalomaniac narcissist. Ruben forces her through a barrier of thorns, a physical manifestation of breaking their toxic bonds. Waiting on the perimeter is a black sedan, highlighting Ruben's superior executive functioning under duress. He secures her inside and initiates a violent acceleration. This reveals a vital truth. Genuine control is rarely exerted through overt violence. True psychological mastery lies in establishing your exit strategy long before the narcissist system inevitably collapses. The accelerates violently as Ruben is aggressive, evasive maneuvers. Stephanie exhibits severe hyperventilation, locked in a state of hyperarousal as she watches the syndicate enforcers swarm the perimeter. An operative assumes a firing stance, Ruben to roar a verbal warning just as gunfire shatters the rear window, showering the interior with glass fragmentation. Ruben wrenches the steering column with brute force, executing a sharp turn that visually severs her from her developmental environment. She falls into a dissociative paralysis, finally processing the cognitive dissonance of her reality. The patriarchal figure she trusted has just authorized her execution. We must recognize a fundamental clinical reality here. While no individual can control the pathological origins of their family dynamic, we maintain the autonomy to select who drives us out of the cycle. We observe Stephanie undergoing an acute psychological decompensation. Ruben monitors her state, his silent observation marking her transition into an active hostile dynamic. Her physiological response is deeply unsettling. She emits a fractured, breathless laugh, a classic indicator of emotional dysregulation as the brain fails to process catastrophic betrayal. She genuinely anticipates their imminent demise. Conversely, Ruben displays extreme emotional blunting, maintaining a steady baseline pulse. A trace of a smile indicates a disturbing comfort with high-stress scenarios as he calmly states the operation is ongoing. Following an hour of complex counter-surveillance driving, they secure the vehicle in an abandoned Brooklyn garage. This phase reinforces a grim therapeutic observation. Cultivating hypervigilance is often the only effective defense mechanism against toxic, predatory attachment figures. You and I have analyzed countless precipitous downfalls, but this collapse is striking. Stephanie's vocal tremors indicate a severe emotional tension as she questions their location in the damp stairwell. Ruben exhibits signs of adrenal fatigue, yet remains hyper-focused on threat mitigation. He has procured an untraceable safe house, completely isolated from syndicate influence. They ascend the agonizing stairs, arriving at a bleak environment containing only a deteriorating couch and a bare mattress. Stephanie enters a catatonic freeze response. Her expensive garments are destroyed, and her physical trauma is evident. She leaves bloody footprints across the floorboards.
She has transitioned from a protected asset to a high-value target.
He gently directs her toward the darkened bathroom. The behavioral lesson is clear. Maintaining an undisclosed sanctuary is essential when pathological systems inevitably rupture. Ruben provides clean garments with minimal interaction, establishing a boundary as the door secures. Stephanie confronts her own image in the fractured mirror, a crucial moment of ego fragmentation. The physical indicators of trauma are severe, encompassing lacerations and significant dermal contusions. She discards the damaged clothing and subjects herself to high-temperature water. Despite the thermal extremity, she experiences sensory numbness, a hallmark of deep psychological shock. She utilizes the intense heat as a purification ritual, attempting to scrub away the psychological residue of her father's narcissistic control. This behavior highlights an important aspect of trauma processing. Often, a subject must endure acute sensory discomfort to process deep emotional contamination. She returns to find Ruben analyzing data on his device and displaying zero physiological markers of the war he just initiated. And she re-enters the primary space, using his oversized clothing as a makeshift security blanket. Ruben passes her the mobile device without a single verbal prompt, an exercise in complete clinical detachment. Her resting heart rate spikes immediately. The digital display is flooded with critical intelligence reports. Federal task forces are executing coordinated dismantling operations across global syndicate networks. Her fine motor skills degrade as she grows past visual urgence of her father's inner sanctum breached by law enforcement. Her orchestrated data leak was highly effective. She has systematically weaponized his own pathological secrecy against him. This dynamic proves a fundamental psychological strategy. Documenting a narcissist's abuse is imperative, as objective evidence is the only mechanism capable of neutralizing their delusions of invulnerability. Ruben simply monitors the perimeter outside. As dawn breaks, the systemic collapse of their familial structures accelerates. Stephanie exhibits its involuntary tremors as her brain processes the magnitude of their defection. The megalomaniac who enforced a god complex upon his dependencies has been successfully institutionalized. When she softly inquires about Ruben's relatives, his vocal affect becomes entirely flat. He confirms his entire patriarchal lineage is being systematically incarcerated. He analyzes her facial tension, probing for any cognitive remorse regarding the destruction of her own name. As Stephanie visualizes the trauma of her highly controlled upbringing, the opulent prison that defined her youth. She maintains direct eye contact, it confirming zero pathological regret. The psychological implication here is stark. Eradicating a toxic attachment system completely is often the absolute prerequisite for establishing independent mental stability. They stand as two ghosts finding peace. Let us examine this interaction carefully. In cases of severe familial enmeshment, silence is merely a dormant phase. The phone vibrates aggressively against the table, delivering a sudden auditory shock. Ruben identifies the incoming caller as his primary male attachment figure, the exact individual responsible for his early child conditioning. He engages the speaker function, subjecting the room to the abusive dynamic. His father's vocal patterns are highly erratic, employing aggressive interrogation tactics to induce guilt over the systemic collapse. We finally observe Ruben's physical composure fail as his hands begin to tremble. He offers a quiet, affirmative response into the dark. The patriarch hurls verbal abuse regarding their ruined legacy, but Ruben counters with intense emotional volatility, citing the pathological rot eating them alive. We must understand a core developmental truth. The primary caregiver is often the primary abuser. The patriarch escalates to overt terroristic threats, exhibiting severe narcissistic rage as he promises extreme punitive measures. Ruben restricts his visual input, closing his eyes to deliver a quiet, defiance-based response before terminating the connection. The subsequent silence creates a profound, agonizing auditory vacuum. Ruben discards the device, experiencing severe post-adrenaline tremors as his central nervous system crashes. Stephanie initiates tactile grounding, carefully interlacing her bruised fingers with his. She probes his emotional stability, asking if he possesses the resilience to process this fractures. Displaying intense depersonalization, he offers Hughes a hollow assurance that he will manage. Stephanie tightens her grip, refusing to let him drown alone, establishing a new secure attachment bond. This data's point is crucial. In the aftermath of catastrophic trauma, a single secure relationship alters the entire math of human survival. Look at the broadcast screen with me and notice the divergent stress responses. Stephanie observes her mother exhibiting a complete hysterical breakdown amidst the flashing lights. Her sibling, Luca, is notably absent. We must analyze Luca's pain through the lens of Stockholm syndrome. He is a victim who has tragically fallen in love with his captor, entirely unable to sever the traumatic bond. Conversely, disintegrates through over-aggression as unchecked fury toward the authorities. A scrolling data feed triggers as a sudden vasovagal response in Stephanie. The state has designated them as active fugitives. Ruben clinically assesses the situation, deducing that the authorities view them merely as prosecutorial instruments. The system only cherishes raw advantage. He poses the final psychiatric evaluation. Is she prepared to permanently bury her abuser? She whispers yes. Let us examine the case file of Stephanie and Ruben. Today, you and I are going to unpack the fascinating pathology of their survival. We see Stephanie in the neon rain, fixated on the destruction of her father's empire. Beside her is Ruben, an enforcer caught in the syndicate's violent machinery. Then we do it, he vows, though his microexpressions betray a profound dread. He knows the incarcerated syndicate heads are classic megalomaniac narcissists. In the criminal underworld, greed consistently overrides interpersonal loyalty. He extends a scarred hand, isolating them from the world. Who is left? She trembles. Just us. The clinical lesson here is stark trauma isolates us, but shared trauma binds us with an unbreakable, desperate chain. Observe their systematic descent into the underground. By dawn, they adopt the behavioral patterns of fugitives. Ruben retrieves illicit currency from rotting floorboards. A classic contingency protocol. They acquire an untraceable vehicle and initiate flight. Notice how their grand strategy regresses into a primitive physiological panic response. Later, inside a desolate diner, the harsh lighting exacerbates Stephanie's acute anxiety. Across the table, Ruben lowers a crumpled newspaper. Both of our fathers, he murmurs, folding the page, pleading innocent. Here we witness the peak pathology of the megalomaniac narcissist. They stare absolute truth in the eye and construct a profound delusion. We learn a vital lesson: extreme arrogance blinds the host to their inevitable ruin.
We must pay close attention to the somatic symptoms of Stephanie's psychological burden. She exhibits repetitive, self-soothing behaviors, endlessly tapping a metal spoon against her mug.
The delusion of the syndicate bosses playing the victim is not lost on her. She questions their long-term viability as fugitives. Ruben, functioning as a grim realist, offers no therapeutic comfort. If they run, they remain targets. If they testify, the cartel will annihilate them. Stephanie's hollow laughter is a textbook defense mechanism against paralyzing despair. She attempts to absorb the blame for his involvement, a symptom of victims who internalize guilt. But Ruben firmly interrupts this cognitive spiral. He acknowledges his own autonomy. The psychological truth we must remember is simple. We cannot carry the weight of destructive choices that others willingly make for themselves. Let us pause and examine this interaction together, shall we? Ruben leans across the table, initiating an intense emotional transfer. He confesses that prior to their bond, he was merely an empty vessel that was executing syndic violence. Clinically, we observe shades of Stockholm Syndrome here, a victim and an enforcer forging a trauma bond against a mutual captor. Stephanie perceives her bruised reflection and rejects his idealization, feeling devoid of virtue. "Good," he whispers. "You're just a human trying to breathe." Redemption does not require moral purity. It only requires the will to change. External reality aggressively intrudes on this clinical breakthrough. The diner bell chimes. 3 predatory figures enter. Ruben's immediate freezing response indicates extreme threat. When confronted with lethal stimuli, the human amygdala hijacks higher cognitive function. Ruben demonstrates remarkable autonomic control. His hand smoothly secures the concealed firearm. Back door on 3. He issues the rapid command to initiate flight. The hostile approaches. 1, 2. Stephanie experiences acute auditory exclusion, her pulse drowning ambient noise as panic peaks. 3. They detonate into a kinetic escape. Ruben physically maneuvers her through the kitchen, bypassing a catatonic bystander. They breach the rear exit into a lightless alleyway. The vehicle is parked at a critical distance. We must learn this harsh truth: poor preparation always demands a brutal payment in blood. Pursuit echoes on the pavement. The neurological shock of gunfire fractures the night. Ruben forces her to the pavement, securing temporary cover behind a steel receptacle. Stephanie's nervous system begins to overload. She experiences violent tremors, desperately questioning the origin of their attackers. Was it her narcissistic father or the syndicate's operational wing? The hostile actors utilize pack hunting tactics in the fog. Ruben makes eye contact, his affect completely flattened, and chambers around. He articulates a profound grief, confessing his desire to suppress his violent conditioning and become a functioning human for her. But the clinical reality is unforgiving. Unresolved trauma will always reassert itself under extreme duress. You cannot simply wish away deeply ingrained violence. He performs a final ammunition check, stripping away all emotion, or coldly instructs her to initiate a solo evacuation the absolute second he draws the enemy fire. Stephanie exhibits acute separation anxiety, physically anchoring herself to his garment. She rejects the logic of solitary survival. But Ruben understands the terminal mathematics of the situation. He initiates sudden, forceful contact, a kiss serving as a transfer of final emotional attachment. Instantly, The psychological switch flips, and the reformed individual reverts to the lethal enforcer. He violently breaks cover, discharging his weapon to neutralize an immediate threat. He deliberately exposes his center of mass to redirect Hack's hostile fire away from her, and Stephanie complies and runs. We recognize a crucial therapeutic truth when another individual sacrifices their safety. For yours, the only functional response is to endure. She breaches the vehicle and engages the ignition, but a glance in the rear-view mirror reveals a grim complication. He has sustained severe ballistic trauma. Let us analyze this critical juncture together. Auditory chaos dominates the environment. Stephanie forces the passenger door open, vocalizing his name through raw panic. Ruben propels his compromised body into the cabin. Utilizing gross motor skills fueled by pure adrenaline, she accelerates violently, breaking the engagement zone. They merge onto a barren highway, entering a dissociative flight state. Eventually, she falters on a desolate shoulder. Ruben exhibits labored respiration, compressing a massive hemorrhage near his ribs. "I am fine," he chokes out. This is a fascinating mechanism. Denial is the human brain's final barrier against the terror of mortality. We lie to ourselves when the truth is simply too heavy to process. She removes his hands to assess the severe trauma. Ruben begins to experience advanced hypovolemic shock. His vocal cords strain as he issues a directive to maintain continuous movement. Directional logic has collapsed, replaced by the primitive compulsion to flee. Stephanie exhibits high-tension motor control, gripping the wheels until her circulation restricts. They secure a room in a dilapidated motel, a structural manifestation of their own psychological ruin. Stephanie utilizes a contaminated currency to bypass registration, supporting Ruben's failing mass. He collapses onto the mattress, pale as ash. She exposes the ballistic trauma, revealing catastrophic tissue disruption. "Ever learn to sew?" he asks with a bloody smirk. We learn a profound lesson here. Human healing only reveals its true resilience when total collapse feels imminent. Observe her fine motor skills deteriorating under extreme psychological distress. Stephanie frantically dismantles a rusted cabinet to secure an expired medical kit. She applies a caustic antiseptic directly to the exposed tissue. Ruben utilizes a soiled towel as an oral fixation device, actively suppressing his vocal pain response. Despite severe autonomic tremors, Stephanie successfully threads the needle, driving it through the ruined muscle fibers. After a sustained period of intense focus, she terminates the final suture. Ruben utilizes derisive humor, critiquing a technique to normalize the trauma. "You kept me alive," she murmurs to the shadows. He maintains intense eye contact. We learn that authentic loyalty is not an obligation, but a silent weight anchored deep within the soul. Examine their behavioral shifts as the environmental stimuli fade. Ruben actively dismantles his psychopathic defenses. He identifies his previous existence as an emotionally vacant instrument for the syndicate, attributing his emotional reawakening to her. This stimulus causes Stephanie's dissociative barriers to collapse. She weeps, articulating her chronic hypervigilance. The constant evasion has eroded her mental stability. Ruben utilizes physical touch to ground her escalating panic. Here is a fundamental truth. The psychological burden of surrender will always decimate a mind faster than the exhaustion of survival. Regret is a terminal disease. He secures her against his intact ribs, shoes, offering a firm cognitive reinforcement that their predators will not claim them tonight. You and I must look at this final sequence clinically. Stephanie rests her head against his chest, avoiding the torn tissue. She verbalizes the anxiety flooding her neurochemistry, the statistical probability of their death. If we fall, he rasps, we go down swinging. Ruben refuses to submit. They enter a fragmented sleep cycle. But we know brutal reality does not reset just because the earth rotates. You cannot terminate a hypervigilant state merely because daylight appears. Suddenly, the room shatters with the high decibel frequency of police sirens. Stephanie experiences an instantaneous cortisol spike, ripping back the cracked blinds. The visual stimulus of flashing red and blue lights confirms the inevitable. The megalomanic's reach is absolute. The clinical study ends here as the authorities arrive. We observe the classic trauma response in the subject, Ruben. Despite his physical injuries, hypervigilance, it overrides basic exhaustion. He wakes before the sirens conclude. A learned adaptation from years among predators, he processes the threat clinically, noting the authorities' tactical error as they bypass the outer rooms. They evacuate the premises at a strictly mid-pace. Medjodpinsk is the behavioral failure that alerts the hunter. Mastery of survival lies in projecting absolute calm while the nervous system screams for flight. 2 blocks into their escape, an unknown phone call shatters their controlled environment. He advises avoidance, but she answers. The voice on the line is Marco. The psychological pathogen has finally located its hosts. The atmospheric tension inside the vehicle mimics the suffocating pressure of an isolation cell. Marco, the enforcer for the megalomaniacal narcissist she calls her father, presents the clinical reality. The syndicate is undergoing violent fragmentation, and her father is reacting with blind, narcissistic rage. Let us look at this together, you and I. Half the underworld seeks to eliminate her, while the remainder views her as a high-value asset. Mark proposes a radical behavioral shift, surrendering to federal authorities.
She rejects this immediately. Here is a fundamental psychiatric truth. One must never cut to architect of their traumatic conditioning to suddenly provide a safe harbor.
She correctly identifies that the institutional authorities possess the same, its monstrous pathology, as the shadows hunting her. Marco exhibits a sudden collapse of his sociopathic defenses, his vocal tone indicating severe emotional distress. Stephanie responds with a hollow, defensive laugh, a classic cognitive dissonance mechanism. Why place faith in an established lethal threat? The environmental baseline shattered when Marco introduces a new variable. He is the sole reason she is alive. Having aborted the coordinated pursuit last night, when pressed for his motivation, the hardened killer's psychological armor completely fractures. He projects these unresolved grief of his own deceased daughter onto Stephanie. It is a haunting observation of human behavior that the most violently conditioned subjects often carry the most paralytic underlying guilt. He urges her to engage the federal agents tomorrow, presenting a final opportunity to sever this intergenerational cycle of violence. Marco presents a cold binary survival matrix. The federal apparatus requires them as instrumental assets to dismantle her father's narcissistic empire. The sole alternative is a fatal termination in the field. The connection terminates. Stephanie experiences physiological tremors, a somatic manifestation of her psychological overload. She articulates the grim reality to Ruben. Neither subject genuinely trusts this conditioned enforcer. Yet, behavioral science dictates that when trapped in a terminal scenario, the human organism will inevitably select the marginally damaged option. Ruben exhibits jaw tension, a marker of suppressed anxiety, bleeding and entirely isolated. He concedes their strategic bankruptcy. They will engage the authorities tomorrow, crossing an irreversible psychological threshold they can never undo. The external violence of the conflict is replaced by an oppressive, clinical silence. The negotiation is set for noon in Manhattan. Let us observe them quietly in this dim diner, you and I. Marco designated this a neutral zone, but Stephanie has long since eradicated her childhood cognitive distortions. Ruben moves with the fragility of a trauma victim, his respiration hindered by severe tissue damage. Stephanie exhibits hyper-vigilant scanning of every environmental stimulus. In a final display of avoidance behavior, Ruben suggests they erase their identities and flee entirely. But here is the inescapable psychological reality of trauma. You can relocate your physical body to the absolute margins of the earth, but your behavioral conditioning always follows. She pushes her cup away. The flight response has officially expired. Ruben observes the profound neurological restructuring in her gaze, verbally acknowledging her psychological evolution. Stephanie establishes grounding physical contact, anchoring her hand to his. Previously, the narcissistic betrayal of her father would have induced a dissociative collapse. Now, we witness the crystallization of a hardened psychological armor. It is a fundamental truth of human resilience that the presence of one secure attachment figure can entirely recalibrate a shattered nervous system. At 11:45, they approach the brutalist architecture of the federal facility. Security checkpoints scan them methodically. Waiting in that stark, fluorescent environment is Marco. His facial affect is entirely flat, demonstrating the hollow, vacant stare of an apex predator finally consumed by his own violent pathology. Marco exhibits the erratic respiration of a subject experiencing an acute panic disorder. His cognitive model had predicted their flight, not their compliance. They enter the sterile environment of the elevator, ascending in a state of sensory deprivation. Marco then introduces a severe psychological shock. Her younger sibling, Luca, is already embedded within the facility as an active informant. Note a profound clinical irony here. Frequently, the fragile dependents we systematically traumatize ourselves to protect, they become the primary agents of our own survival. Stephanie experiences a complex emotional spike. Paralyzing dread win over for physical safety, counterbalanced by a fierce pride in his behavioral autonomy. The steel doors part, exposing them to the harsh illumination of the institutional corridor as they step forward to face their reality. They are guided through a structured institutional labyrinth. While tactical personnel process data, Stephanie's focal point locks onto Luca. Separated from the pathological environment of the syndicate, his physiological immaturity is glaringly obvious. Upon visual confirmation of her survival, Luca abandons all emotional regulation, initiating desperate physical contact. He had fully integrated the assumption of her determination. This illustrates a severe reality. In predator ecosystems, one must never project the luxury of future disability onto their primary attachments. Luca projects his gratitude onto Ruben, viewing him as the protector. Ruben clinically corrects this misattribution. He Stephanie's autonomous resilience as the definitive factor, stating he merely avoided impeding her. The reunion is abruptly severed by Special Agent Chen and an emotionally detached prosecutor named Wallace. Luca exhibits severe separation anxiety, maintaining a rigid physical hold on his sister. Chen delivers the reality of their investigation. The Bureau has acquired comprehensive documentation of the father's pathological footprint, the mind financial networks, the systematic violence. It is sufficient to enforce permanent and physical containment. In syndicate culture, this is the ultimate transgression. Yet an objective psychological truth remains. Gender linkage does not mandate submissions to a destructive parasitic relationship. Displaying a remarkable absence of emotional distress, Stephanie does not shed a tear. She evaluates the judicial machinery and clinically authorizes the permanent institutionalization of her familial abusers. You and I recognize that institutional systems never provide an exit strategy, never without extracting value. Stick with me, because this is the moment the behavioral contract is negotiated. Chen outlines the condition. The prosecution requires their public testimony, utilizing their trauma to manipulate a jury. Ruben adopts a transactional mindset, demanding comprehensive identity erasure. The prosecutor projects a false aura of security to ID. However, Stephanie identifies the critical flaw, inquiring about the exact duration of this protection. Note this fundamental behavioral heuristic. Never accept an environmental guarantee without analyzing the underlying liabilities. Wallace concedes the impermanence of their safety, merely theorizing that the sociopathic infighting among rival syndicates will serve as a sufficient distraction. The prosecutor hypothesizes that the criminal ecosystem will be consumed by internal retaliation. Ruben correctly identifies this as a catastrophic risk failure. Wallace counters that their current trajectory guarantees fatal termination. As for the juvenile, Luca will enter protective custody until developmental maturity. Agent Chen attempts to establish trust by pledging his professional reputation. Stephanie, however, exhibits total immunity to verbal manipulation. She clinically informs him that his linguistic assurances hold zero empirical value. Observe this critical dynamic. Authentic trust is forged exclusively through verifiable behavioral consistency and polished institutional rhetoric. She establishes visual contact with Ruben, signaling their mutual acceptance of this highly unstable operational gamble. Ruben breaches the interrogation room doors, his system requiring immediate oxygen to manage the acute stress response. Positioned in the sterile corridor,
Marco engages in a self-soothing nicotine fixation. Stephanie experiences a brief emotional decompensation, her vocal tremors betraying fear as she accuses him of orchestrating their execution.
Marco exhibits a drastically lowered heart rate. He exhales a measured plume of smoke before deconstructing her entire perception of reality. He is the primary architect of the syndicate's collapse, functioning as the central informant for 3 months. Document this behavioral axiom. Frequently, the most unassuming profiles in a mathological environment are covertly manipulating the entire framework. The theft of the ledgers merely accelerated his operational timeline. Let us open the file on Marco. He extinguishes his cigarette, the friction echoing like a gunshot in the hall. He coldly dissects the psychological decay of Stephanie's father, a classic megalomaniac narcissist drowning in internal paranoia. The patriarch's fractured his natural psyche was driving his own syndicate towards slaughter. Marco's betrayal was a calculated intervention to preserve viable subjects like Stephanie. When she demands to know why she was kept blind, Marco remains clinically detached. A single micro-expression of awareness from her would have triggered her father's homicidal reflex. This presents a necessary behavioral lesson. Subterfuge is the most effective survival mechanism when dealing with severe pathology. In this ecosystem, his silence was her only armor. Look at the neurological toll of violence in Marco's eyes. Had he failed to mask himself as a sociopathic enforcer, the syndicate would have deployed genuine psychopaths. Her survival probability would have been 0. When Ruben questions his futures, The giant offers a passive shrug. He is transitioning into witness protection, effectively erasing his identity. Stephanie's response is an uncharacteristic display of attachment, embraces the man who orchestrated her terror. This illustrates a vital psychological lesson. Maintaining a cognitive grudge is irrational when your perceived tormentor was actively bleeding to cure your existence. Marco stiffens, his nervous system unaccustomed to positive stimuli. Before reciprocating, he warns the conflict remains active and she accepts it. The tribunal is 6 weeks out. The collapsing syndicates are hemorrhaging capital, displaying the desperation of cornered predators attempting to neutralize liabilities. In a sterile room, Wallace initiates a high-pressure tactic, demanding the subjects be isolated in separate facilities. And Stephanie's autonomic arousal spikes instantly. She locks onto the tourney, establishing a rigid boundary, guaranteeing total non-compliance if they sever her primary attachment figure. This behavioral standoff provides an essential clinical lesson. One must never allow an institutional machine to dictate terms when the individual controls the necessary data. Recognizing the absolute lack of bluff in her cold eyes, Agent Chen intervenes. With a heavy sigh, he wisely capitulates to her unyielding leverage. Examine this phase closely as systemic trauma takes root. Wallace establishes absolute compliance parameters, knowing the state abandons useless assets. The weeks require a brutal psychological excavation. Stephanie must verbally exhume her abuse, while the terror undergoes semantic satiation, rendering the horrific mundane. Reuben endures the same clinical vivisection. The state treats them merely as biological hard drives containing data. This underscores a chilling life lesson. Bureaucratic architecture possesses zero empathy for internal devastation, prioritizing only the extraction of a conviction. Stripped of their humanity, the fractured subjects are deposited into a highly secured, visually sterile containment structure hidden deep within the cold shadows of New Jersey. The safe house is an isolated terrarium monitored by cameras. The absence of threat stimuli allows their hypervigilant nervous systems to downregulate. They collapse into deep decompression, their shared silence functioning as a cognitive sanctuary. Reuben plays vintage cinema while Stephanie engages in grounding physical contact. To an observer, it is mundane, but for them, it is salvation. The life lesson is clear. Establishing a secure attachment with a stable entity provides a baseline that corrupt wealth cannot replicate. Still, post-traumatic stress is cyclical. By week 3, Stephanie's sleep architecture shatters. She violently awakens in respiratory distress. Her amygdala, hijacked by nightmare of the narcissistic tyrant she left to burn. Reuben applies deep pressure therapy, pulling her trembling form against him, verbally reinforcing her safety. This stabilization period ends on a freezing February morning. The courthouse operates as a tactical environment, crawling with snipers. In the corridors, we observe the juvenile Luca. His affect is completely flattened, exhibiting the dissociative numbness of profound Stockholm syndrome. He carries the psychological rota of his captors. This provides a tragic life lesson. Severe environmental trauma violently evicts innocence, calcifying a developing brain long before its time. The atmospheric pressure spikes as Agent Chen breaches the oak doors. Positioned at the defense tables, like deposed pathological royalty, sit the very narcissistic monsters who gave them life. Let us step inside this clinical theater. Stephanie locks eyes with Adriano, the megalomaniac narcissist who commodified her existence. His presentation is devoid of empathy. His gaze is clinically dead, processing his offspring merely as a miscalculated variable. Conversely, Antonio lacks all impulse control, vibrating with narcissistic rage. This dynamic teaches a brutal lesson. The biological entity is designated as your caregiver, as sometimes the exact pathological predators you must escape to ensure your survival. The magistrate suppresses the dysregulated atmosphere. As Yajdiast is identified to testify, her lower extremities exhibit autonomic stress tremors, yet her posture remains rigidly defiant. Taking the oath, she cognitively commits to dismantling their entire empire of lies. The interrogator asks the catalyst question regarding her relationship to the subject. Stephanie anchors to the stand. She confirms he is her father, bypassing her trauma blocks. She surgically dismantles his narcissistic matrix, detailing the illicit finances and the premeditated plot against Ruben. She catalogues the manipulation of her arranged marriage and desperate extraction from a window. This illustrates a behavioral lesson. The human psyche can only be compressed to a specific threshold before it generates a violent counter-response. She exposes a documented history of homicides. Throughout this dismantling of his ego structure, Adriano maintains a psychopathic flat affect. He sits as a lifeless statue, exhibiting zero remorse as his flesh and blood reduces his kingdom to ash. The inquiry targets her fear response. Stephanie establishes unbroken visual contact with her abuser. She explicitly denies his psychological dominance, stating he no longer possesses ownership over her autonomy. As the gallery erupts and she steps down, she effectively severs her conditioned trauma bonds. Here is a clinical life lesson. Genuine resilience is achieved by recognizing your intrinsic value and terminating the authority of toxic blood over your destiny. Next, Ruben assumes the stand. His testimony is a methodical dissection of the syndicate's buried secrets. This exposure triggers a narcissistic collapse in Antonio. The patriarch dysregulates, screaming accusations of cowardice before the magistrate's containment, buzzing, exposing their profound familial rupture. Antonio's implosion leaves him a dysregulated husk. The grueling trial functions towards prolonged exposure therapy. The jury requires a mere 4 hours to clinically terminate the organization. Guilty, Adriano, displaying end-stage narcissistic detachment, absorbs the ruin with psychopathic stillness. Antonio, incapable of processing the ego injury, devolves into primal screaming as restraints are applied. Stephanie initiates grounding contact with Ruben, her respiratory patterns finally normalizing. The judge mandates 30 years of steel isolation without parole. This confirms a behavioral lesson. The universe maintains equilibrium, and pathological actions collect catastrophic debts. The media chaos outside is irrelevant. The psychological nightmare is buried. Stick with me, because you and I are about to observe the cognitive shift from acute survival mode to genuine post-traumatic growth. As chaotic stimuli bombard them, Ruben assumes a deer posture. Luca asks about their Stephanie's facial musculature relaxes, outlining a detachment from their previous network. Agent Chen facilitates this identity transplant, providing documentation to construct a fabricated history in Oregon. Ruben acknowledges his geographical inexperience, but Stephanie Bride provides immediate verbal stabilization. Document this life lesson. Executing a blind transition into an unmapped reality is far preferable enduring neurological decay within a familiar but toxic ecosystem. They descend the steps, abandoning the bloody wreckage of their past forever. We conclude our observation in a constrained Portland apartment at the maximum psychological distance from the grandiose pathology of the Mafia estates. Stephanie exhibits zero defensive posturing, observing the rain without scanning for threats. The smell of coffee acts as a grounding mechanism. Ruben initiates physical contact while she tactilely maps the scar tissue on his ribs. You and I know the hardest clinical truth. Sometimes, a subject must incinerate the toxic familial structures assigned at birth to achieve baseline neurological stability in mundane environments. He asks about the frequency of her night terrors. Her slow nod confirms the trauma loop has broken. The pathological predators are erased, leaving only the therapeutic silence of a normal, unthreatened existence. Ruben leans over the counter, the rigid tension of his scarred face relaxing as heavy footsteps break the morning silence. Luca shuffles into the kitchen, hunting for cereal. The clinical extinction of his trauma is fascinating. His previous hypervigilance lynching at a firing engine has vanished entirely. Stephanie pours her coffee. Observing this ordinary routine, she asks Ruben about his schedule. This former syndicate enforcer, a man conditioned to break bones without a spike in heart rate, now wears a suit and admits a corporate meeting terrifies him. Stephanie simply smiles. You and I must understand a fundamental psychological truth. Rebuilding your neural pathways to accept a quiet, honest existence demands far more courage than ruling an empire built on violence. The kitchen settles into a quiet baseline, devoid of the armed guards that once dictated their environment. By noon, Stephanie takes her position at a dusty bookstore. The older proprietor never questions why Stephanie exhibits an exaggerated start-to-start response when a door slams. The greatest therapeutic gift you can offer mind running on from severe trauma is absolute neutrality. Suddenly, the brass bell chimes. Shadow steps out of the driving rain wearing a heavy overcoat. Stephanie freezes. Her nervous system fully anticipates the arrival of her father's executioners. But the stranger merely shakes his umbrella and asks for the poetry section, and slowly, her parasympathetic nervous system engages, lowering her icing heart rate back down into a state of ordinary relief. She exhales a ragged breath, pressing her pale hands flat against the counter. Prolonged exposure to a violent environment leaves deep neurological fractures. Stephanie still endures severe night terrors, suffocating on the sensory memory of her blood-stained wedding. Ruben still bolts awake at 3 a.m, his brain permanently wired to anticipate assassins. Reprogramming that conditioning requires exhausting cognitive effort. Later, we observe them in the isolated warmth of their kitchen. They boil pasta and laugh at mundane things. The physical threats are gone. The clinical lesson here is vital. True sanctuary is not merely a location, but an active daily psychological choice. They stand by the foggy window, finally allowing their minds to process the safety they earned. The rain taps a steady rhythm against the glass as Ruben he asks the question that still triggers his survivor guilt. Does she regret dismantling their violent familial structures to become completely anonymous? Stephanie rests her cheek against his chest. She evaluates her memories of those colder states, recognizing the psychological void, and shakes her head. Rejecting her father's megalomaniac narcissism was her ultimate cognitive triumph. We all eventually discover this fundamental truth. Stability is not found in the paranoid hoarding of power. It is the freedom to exist without hypervigilance. She whispers she would burn the syndicate to ash 1,000 times to reach this room. Ruben pulls her closer, their shared trauma finally dormant. 2 years of stability successfully reduce their chronic stress markers. They transition to a weathered bungalow. Stephanie engages in behavioral grounding, stubbornly cultivating a vibrant garden. It is a safe space where they maintain total autonomy. Luke is at university, demonstrating a secure attachment style by calling every Sunday. Stephanie channels her survival mechanisms into a non-profit from extracting runaways from the antisocial networks that conditioned her. Sublimating your severe trauma into a protective barrier for others is the ultimate psychological victory. Ruben redirected his tactical aggression into corporate strategy, neutralizing his cognitive dissonance. They are systematically constructing a secure reality far outside the clinical pathology of their violent origins. Analyze this interaction with me. Porch lights cut through the fog as Stephanie parks her car. Ruben is waiting on the steps. This subject previously dismantled human targets without hesitation, yet now experiences a massive spike in cortisol. He is entirely frozen. His fingers exhibit visible motor tremors around a velvet box. He verbalizes a critical clinical distinction. Their initial bonding was a trauma response, a mutual survival mechanism. This new proposal is a deliberate choice. He reveals a plain gold band, devoid of cartel diamonds, acting as psychological leverage. Healthy attachment is never coerced. It is constructed through the voluntary decision to remain vulnerable. Stephanie exhibits an acute emotional release, weeping as she accepts the ring, solidifying their newly adaptive bond. 6 months later, they legalized their union in a sterile county courthouse. The environmental contrast is staggering. There are no megalomaniac crime bosses asserting dominance through displays of wealth. They are surrounded by fluorescent lights and the few subjects who survived their systemic trauma. Luca stands in the front row, his emotional affect entirely positive. Marco, operating under an assumed identity to evade assassination, sends white lilies. We understand the severe pathological weight of their history, but this proves a whole concept. No matter how violently your early environment conditioned you, conscious intervention allows you to rewrite your behavioral baseline. The judge formalizes the contract, and Stephanie initiates a fierce kiss, overriding her past negative conditioning. 5 years of stability pass. Stephanie stands by the window, using the warmth of her coffee mug as a sensory anchor. The acoustic silence does not trigger the paranoid dread of a cartel strike. It signifies a successfully reclaimed nervous system. A 3-year-old girl enters, dragging a worn, stuffed rabbit. She possesses Ruben's dark hair and Stephanie's resilient phenotype. When the child demands breakfast, Stephanie experiences a surge of oxytocin, lifting her high. The clinical evidence is undeniable. No matter how deeply your developmental years were contaminated by toxicity, you can consciously cultivate a healthy family dynamic. Ruben enters next. The formerly ruthless enforcer has entirely transitioned into a nurturing parental figure, kissing his wife before preparing breakfast. Observing her husband in this domestic routine, a profound cognitive realization anchors itself in Stephanie's mind. She successfully executed an extraction from a sociopathic environment. Psychological equilibrium is rarely passive. It requires aggressive behavioral modification and discipline tolerance. But surviving a megalomaniac narcissist always incurs collateral damage. Later that afternoon, she drives to an isolated cemetery, halting at Marco's grave. He was her hypervigilant protector, bound to her through severe traumatic bonding. His compromised cardiovascular system finally failed a year ago. The Meshamekeltaf assured her the fatal cardiac event was rapid. Staring at the frozen grass, she experiences a wave of survivor guilt, desperately hoping their clinical assessments was accurate. She kneels in the damp grass, placing flowers against the cold granite. Her fingers trace the engraved letters, engaging in a vital grief processing ritual. In the quiet void of the cemetery, she verbalizes her thoughts to the deceased. She details the behavioral milestones of her daughter, noting the genetic inheritance of her own oppositional defiance. We must recognize the importance of this closure. Honoring the individuals who absorbed our trauma allows the nervous system to process residual grief. A cold wind rustles the branches as she whispers a final expression of gratitude. The timeline shifts to the evening. Their residence is perfectly quiet. Stephanie and Ruben sit on the porch, utilizing physical touch to regulate their nervous systems while watching fireflies. On the quiet porch, the dialogue shifts as to their core trauma. Ruben inquires if the pathological influence of their fathers still triggers intrusive thoughts. She leans against him, confirming those violent cognitive loops are finally experiencing extinction. 2 years prior, her father's narcissistic reign terminated predictably with a fatal altercation in a prison yard. She exhibited zero emotional distress. The psychiatric reality is clear. Toxic figures only lose their neurological grip when you actively sever the attachment. Ruben's father remains in solitary confinement, isolated by his antisocial paranoia. She asks what his psychological trajectory would be without the intervention. He answers immediately. He would be a dissociated enforcer, ruling a violent hierarchy he consciously despised. The timeline shifts forward, abandoning their violent origins. The environment transitions to a rainy afternoon. Ruben establishes eye contact, stripped of his maladaptive Mafia grandiosity, and articulates a clinical truth. She interrupted his destructive psychological spiral. Stephanie smiles, tracing his facial scarring to confirm their mutual intervention. Society perpetually seeks idealized saviors, but functional attachment is often just due to deeply traumatized subjects choosing to co-regulate each other's damaged nervous systems. They sit quietly under the evergreens. She navigated the severe trauma of her father's cartel to engineer a stable reality. Fast forward through a decade of sustained behavioral health. Their daughter observes the rain and asks the foundational question, how did you two meet? Observe the subject, Stephanie, sitting in the dim light. Notice the slight tremor in her hands. Clinically, she is managing profound post-traumatic stress. She never mentions the syndicate, burying the trauma deep to shield her child. Instead, she repatches her survival onto a bedtime myth about a poisoned kingdom. It requires massive psychological fortitude, completely dismantle your reality. But here is a simple truth about resilience. True freedom demands a heavy cognitive toll. You pay for it by shedding the defensive armor that kept you alive. Yet, her scars are merely the map leading to this quiet room. She severed ties with the megalomaniacal narcissist who controlled her and ensuring her daughter never inherits that terror. Breaking the cycle of violence is the ultimate revenge. We observed her navigate a severe threat environment. Now, standing in the doorway, the hypervigilance of her past is replaced by deep calm. That old terror dissolves into gratitude. The psychological lesson is simple. The true measure of a life is not the coercive power you wield, but the absolute miracle of feeling safe. She closes her eyes, processing the complex trauma bonds that saved her. Ruben, who remained an anchor. Luca, whose intense Stockholm syndrome fractured into empathy, offering mercies instead of a bullet. And Marco, who stood as a physical barrier against death. With a soft click, she turns off the light. Her husband holds her tightly in the quiet dark. Together, they are grounded in an ordinary reality. fully reconstructed from the ashes of total psychological ruin. We are closing this case file. Outside, the systemic pathology of the underworld continues, consume the innocent to feed a hollow greed, but those maladaptive structures no longer reach her. Here, there is only stability. Stephanie was conditioned to be currency for violent men, meant to be leveraged in a blood-stained alliance. Instead, she completely rewired her behavioral responses, proving that severe trauma is not a permanent life sentence. You and I can take a profound lesson from her quiet rebellion. No matter how deeply the cycle of violence is ingrained, you possess the cognitive agency to dictate your own survival. She built her sanctuary directly from the remnants of their control. Have a good night, and remember that you always retain the power to step out of the dark. The final lesson from the story is about breaking Greek generational cycles. Stephanie, as mother, Elena, reveals that she also entered an arranged marriage and learned to accept it. Instead of helping Stephanie escape the same fate,
she tells her that she shows how pressure gets from one relationship to another.
People who were once hurt may later defend the same system because they believe survival requires obedience. Stephanie's refusal to accept this role becomes an act of generational resistance. She does not want to become another silent woman used as a bargaining chip. She does not want love to be replaced by business or family to be replaced by control. Her decision to expose her father's crimes is not only a personal rebellion, it is an attempt that has harmed many people before her. This is a powerful educational message. Many families, workplaces, and communities repeat harmful traditions because that is how things have always been done. But history does not have to become destiny. A person can honor where they came from while still rejecting what is harmful. Stephanie's story teaches that breaking a cycle often comes with fear, loss, and uncertainty. She may lose wealth, protection, and family approval, but she gains something more important, the possibility of a life built on truth. Ruben Essu's choice to stand with her also shows that change requires allies. One person can begin the fight, but transformation becomes stronger when others choose courage and hopeful. The broad lesson is hopeful. Even if someone is born into a world of control, they're not condemned to repeat it. Education should inspire people to question injustice, protect their dignity, and create a future that is freer than the past.